This story is about a girl who was very famous in secular circles, who also brought her Count's family to their knees. Despite her beauty, people called her the goddess of investments. She was the eldest daughter of Count Eldrin and had many secrets that only her closest people knew. Charming blue eyes that shone like the endless sea, light ash-colored hair enveloped her. And the name of this lady was Ines Eldrin. The action of this interesting story begins with Ines sitting in a chair, who, while carefully studying the latest newspaper news, stumbles upon an article stating that the Adres ship sank. The depressed Ines could not accept this news, because everything happened due to the stupidest situation. Since the ship was not even attacked by pirates or caught in a storm, no one could have thought that it would catch fire due to failure to follow fire safety rules. Ines ordered the servants to urgently prepare the carriage for her trip to the bank. And literally, in a couple of minutes, she was on her way. Sitting in the carriage and looking at all the passing buildings, Ines thought that if she didn't want to go bankrupt, she would have to buy a building in a very good and expensive area. But she was worried that after buying the building, it might also catch fire. Upon arriving at the bank, she was greeted at the entrance by an employee who addressed her with great respect and invited her inside. The bank visitors noticed Mrs. Eldrin and began to whisper among themselves, discussing the latest news about the sunken ship and how she had recently lost money on everything she had invested in. But despite her beauty and the many nicknames given to Eldrin, the most unique was the goddess of investment. Because no matter what she touched, everything burned. Unexpectedly for everyone, robbers burst into the bank, shouting in a threatening voice, and threatening that no one should move and everyone should remain in their places. Ines looked at the robbers and began to wonder if a world disaster had happened to her. First the loss of a large sum of money, then the sinking of the ship, also her coming of age, and the conversations about marriage. Just the other day, Ines was thinking about what single women need. A reliable family, education, or close friends. Everything was wrong because the right answer was money. Moreover, another noble lady who visited Ines a couple of days ago was interested in knowing when the dear lady was getting married. Because if she delayed this matter, she might miss the golden years of her life. Sitting across from a cup of tea, listening attentively and watching the lady fanning herself, Ines asked her if she really needed to get married, because after the coming-of-age ceremony, she only heard questions about marriage. Smiling and raising a cup of tea, Ines informed the respected lady that she was busy making money now, and she had no time to think about marriage, but in response, she heard that no matter how much money she earned, she wouldn't be able to get married. Especially for those moments, Ines always had a bank statement which showed. And seeing the amount, most interlocutors fell silent. The embarrassed lady immediately began to praise her handsome son, telling Ines that she needed a man who knew how to manage money well, and that her son was exactly who she needed. But Ines explained to such a distinguished guest that throughout her years of investing, she understood one thing: the more money, the better, and her only ability helped her in this. At every meeting with future partners, Ines Eldrin behaved as befits a respected person, introducing herself and at the same time extending her hand for a handshake. And when they responded with a mutual handshake, her ability made itself felt. Ines is able to see the misfortunes that will happen to other people in the future. Ines could learn about misfortunes not only through handshakes, but also through simple encounters. And thanks to this ability, she always knew how to make the best decision when meeting more people. But when Ines found herself at the bank, she thought that in the morning she had lost the invested money. She had become a hostage, and all this because her ability had suddenly disappeared a month ago. Sitting next to the unknown young man, Ines hoped that her maid, Sean Moore, who remained on the street, had already called for help. Throughout this time, the robbers searched for bank checks, but to their great regret, they only found some incomprehensible documents. The young man sitting next to Ines said that those were his documents in a completely calm voice, without showing the slightest fear or anxiety. The bank employee approached Mrs. Eldrin to apologize and warned her that they would take care of her well-being. But the employee's call sounded quite loud, and upon hearing the name Eldrin, the robbers rejoiced, because for a representative of this family, they could receive a large ransom. While the gang leader rejoiced and imagined himself being showered with gold coins, a calm young man suddenly lunged at the robber and threw him out of the field like a pawn. Everyone was shocked by this act. It was noticeable that the other robbers hesitated and did not understand who this madman in black was. But without thinking for long, he dealt with the rest of the assailants. When the problem with the robbers was resolved, the young man asked the bank employee if they could accept his documents now. But he was clearly surprised by the whole situation and replied that now was not the right time. Hearing the conversation, Ines offered her help to the young man, since he saved her from wasting time while being a hostage. Approaching him, Mrs. Ines asked him to accompany her to the VIP room, but she was interested in what this man was doing. So she casually took his hand. And at that moment, her ability returned, and she clearly did not expect to see this in her visions. She heard people screaming for help as the owner of the demonic sword went crazy. The demonic sword Tagrios, which cut down a sacred tree, was a cursed sword that led its owner to death. Ines stood paralyzed looking at him and realized that he was the most famous person in the empire. Although not even of the empire, but of the continent. The young man looked at the lady as she froze, but after a moment he asked her to let go of his hand. At that moment, knights rushed to the bank with an order for everyone to lay down their arms. But looking back, they realized they were late, and their captain was standing to the side. Ines, looking at the man in black, realized that this was the unluckiest man in the world, whose name was Kaladas Dion. He was also the head of the 3rd detachment of Imperial Knights, and the owner of a demonic sword. Following the knights, Shammer ran and frightened and only asked if her mistress was injured. But Ines calmed her down and asked her to wait a minute. Ines ran out into the street after Khaled, but at that moment he had already disappeared. Ines felt her ability returning. Shammer followed, still worried about her mistress, and suggested she see a doctor. Looking back, Ines repeated that she was fine and that they needed to visit one more place, since Ines needed to make sure her ability had returned to her. Having gotten into the carriage, they headed to the hippodrome, where Ines deliberately stood in the center of the crowd. People placing bets and walking around accidentally touched Ines, and she saw how people would be surprised after a while by the victory of horse number 6. Later that evening, sitting in her room with a glass of red wine in her hand, Ines told Shamer how she bought 100 tickets for horse number 6, and upon hearing this statement, everyone clicked their tongues. After all, everyone was betting on horses with high chances of winning, and when they heard about buying 100 tickets, they said the lady knew nothing about horse racing. But when it was announced that horse number 6 had won, everyone was stunned. And they couldn't believe it, their envy was off the charts. When the next morning arrived, Ines was sitting in her office in a state of fury. No one could have thought that the ability would disappear again after appearing for only one day. Ines began to review yesterday in her head and realized that her ability had returned after touching Khaled Azdian. And she wanted to know more about him. Among many documents, Ines found his biography. He was the eldest son of the Marquis of Azdian and owner of a demonic sword, the commander of the 3rd detachment of Imperial Knights. Single and without a lover. Khaled also came from an orphanage, and the Marquis's family adopted him, but a couple of years later they had their own son. But still, Khaled is the successor to the Marquis of Azdian. According to his colleagues, Khaled Azdian has a bad temper and was nicknamed a bloodthirsty murderer. But owning such a sword, Khaled will die in a year. Reading more and more, Ines understood that with a destiny like Khaled's, it would be a sin not to be a bastard. There are no ups and downs in life. Everyone sooner or later will be buried. The story of the demonic sword Tigrios is very old. It was with it that the sacred tree was cut, and now the sword appears once in a cycle. And it chooses its owner. The owners become people of different status and nationality. But they only have one thing in common: they lose their minds exactly 1 year after this sword fell into their hands. After the sword's owner appears, paladins are sent out of the temple. And when the time comes, they hand over the owner of the demonic sword to the temple. But every owner has their own time, but among all, none manage to be handed over to the temple. So Khaled Asdian has a limited life. This story passes from generation to generation. And anyone can be its main character. To confirm her conjectures, Ineakutes needed to meet Khaled again. But this was very problematic, since his movements consisted only of home and work. But Ineakutes had a brilliant idea that she herself needed to create a reason for the meeting. Since she found interesting information in the report. The report indicated that Khaled visited his favorite weapon shop on the first Wednesday of every month. Without thinking twice, Ineakutes bought a weapon shop that Khaled visits and deliberately waited there until the shop workers could not stop admiring the new owner. One of the workers asked the new owner if she needed anything necessary. But Ineakutes replied with a smile on her face that they could calmly continue with their business. The workers were delighted with Ineakutes. They informed her that they would be at the forge, and if she suddenly needed anything, she should call them immediately. Ineakutes looked around and understood that these strong men would feel uncomfortable at first. But over time, they would get used to her. Moreover, only one question interested them: would the new owner fire them? And would it be possible for them to leave work on time? Ineakutes reassured them, and they got back to work calmly. But she herself realized that the previous owner was even more of a bastard. While the new owner of the weapon shop was thinking, the door opened and her expected client entered. Khaled Asdian. Ineakutes jumped up from her chair and greeted him, adding that she had recently become the new manager of this shop. But without any emotion, Khaled extended his sword, asking for it to be repaired, and Ineakutes needed at least the slightest touch. When her ability reappeared, she realized that Khaled Asdian was her luck. Upon this touch, Ineakutes noticed her failure, which was that she left early and wanted to eat a special stew. But it ran out right in front of Khaled's nose. After what she saw, Ineakutes could not understand why they call him a bloodthirsty murderer. Taking the sword in her hands, Ineakutes informed Khaled that there was a queue of orders in his shop, and that therefore his order would only be completed in 2 days. Ineakutes thought that first they needed to get closer somehow, and decided to take advantage of that incident at the bank. Asking Khaled if it was him, to which she heard a negative answer. Khaled made Ineakutes nervous. She fell silent and tried not to show that something had not gone according to her plan, although she perfectly understood that she could not be wrong about the obvious. And then she reminded him that she was the same hostage during the bank robbery and thanked Khaled for saving her. Putting the sword aside and taking out her business card, Ineakutes handed it to Khaled, telling him that then it was not possible. Taking the business card and putting it under his cloak, Khaled said he would return for the sword in 2 days. He turned around and started to leave. Ineakutes was indignant at this. She did not think that he would just pick up and leave, so she decided that she would not let him go so easily. Catching up with him, Ineakutes shouted his name. Khaled Asdian slowly stopped and turned to the new owner of the weapon shop. Ineakutes realized that she needed to act right now and offered her help with Khaled's misfortunes. Khaled Asdian looked at Ineakutes and could not understand what her goal was. He only asked her one question: is it really all about money? Laughing, Ineakutes warned Khaled that she had a lot of money, but after her words, she began to feel like some kind of terrible person. But this feeling quickly disappeared. Approaching him, Ineakutes grabbed Khaled by the cloak and pulled him towards her, telling him that he needed to bend down. But he began to resist. Then Ineakutes began to explain to him that she could tell him about the misfortunes that would befall Khaled in the future. And she asked him to accept her offer. Khaled escaped from Ineakutes' hands and loudly ordered her to calm down. But Ineakutes, looking him in the eyes, told him that if he wanted to try that stew, he should arrive at the establishment 10 minutes earlier than usual. Turning around, Khaled walked towards the exit. And Ines, with a smile on her face, warned him that he could arrive at any time. And that she would be waiting for him. Near the carriage bank, Ines was waiting for her maid Shimmer, and asked why this young man was so important to her mistress that she even ordered an investigation. Ines immediately explained everything, that for her he was like a hen laying golden eggs. After meeting this young man, Ines regained her strength, although she herself still does not understand why this happens. After listening to her mistress, Shammer immediately informed her that she would personally take care of Master Khaled Azdian. Ines always liked her maid's frankness. Shammer was the only person who knew about Ines' ability. With the exception of her maternal grandfather and her younger brother, Ines took her under her protection after Chammer was expelled from the family. And she became a mercenary. Halfway through the journey, Chammer remembered that there was a letter for her mistress and handed it to Ines. Looking at the envelope, she realized that it was an invitation for the next visit. Looking out the window at the small streets, Ines thought about how tired she was of this. Because now she needed to make money, and she didn't know where to find time for dates. However, the more money you have, the better it is for you, but money can attract some parasites. It always happened to Ines that her partners imposed dates on her relatives, and that's why she thought about finding a boyfriend to cover herself. But Ines understood that anyone would not be suitable for this role, and she needed someone who was not interested in her. And who knew how to keep his mouth shut, but he also had to be famous and capable. 3 days passed, and Khaled did not show up at the weapon shop. Ines became furious and decided that she had to pressure him more. Her ability was becoming unstable, and Ines realized that it was about to disappear again. And most likely, she would have to visit Khaled at his home herself. At that moment, Chammer was entering her office with letters for the mistress, and suddenly her gaze fell on a red envelope, which is used for marriage proposals or marriage negotiations. Handing her a stack of envelopes, Ines immediately noticed that Chammer, as always, sorted them by importance. Immediately taking the red envelope in her hand, Ines began to look at who sent it. And she couldn't believe what she saw. It was the Marquis Azdian, Khaled's family. Starting to laugh and rejoice at the same time, Ines turned to Shammer to prepare the carriage, since they were heading towards the bride. Meanwhile, at the estate of the Marquis of Azdian, preparations were in full swing for the arrival of Ines Eldrin. Servants had to have time to cut roses in the garden, dust, and much more. The second son of the Marquis Azdian, Dahad Azdian, also prepared for his arrival, because it is for him that all this fuss is happening. When Dahad approached his mother, he immediately asked her if it was worth inviting Khaled here. But his mother calmed him down and told him that they should show a family where harmony reigns. For Dahad it was an important day, and he feared that Khaled would spoil it. Giving him a disdainful look, he muttered quietly that Khaled was a vile bastard. Upon going out into the street, the Marquis Azdian was already imagining how they would relate to the Eldrin family. And they would gain political influence. And his mother was thinking about a large dowry. Approaching her husband, she whispered in his ear that it would be good to use Ines Eldrin as a political background. And both smiled from ear to ear. The Marquis Azdian added that, according to rumors, Count Eldrin was vacationing out of town. And his younger brother, Ines, was studying at the academy. Mrs. Azdian was surprised, because it turned out that Lady Eldrin lived alone in a huge mansion. But after thinking for a while, she suggested that they could move into the mansion of the Count of Eldrin, which made her very happy. But Dahad Azdian proposed another idea, that the dowry could be used to build a new and huge Azdian mansion. Mrs. Azdian was even happier and began to be even prouder of her clever son for such ideas. Standing on the sidelines and listening to all this nonsense, Khaled could no longer be here. His thoughts were about one thing: how tired he was of all this. On the way to the Marquis Azdian's estate, Ines began to guess that it was most likely about the younger son, Dahad Azdian, and most likely he wanted to negotiate her marriage. Inez has always refused marriage negotiations, without even reading the letters. But then she has the opportunity to meet Khaled, and this time she definitely needs to convince him. When the carriage approached the estate, the servants loudly announced that Lady Ines Eldrin had arrived. Upon getting out of the carriage, Inez immediately drew attention to Khaled and noticed that he clearly had a bad relationship with his family because he was standing very far away. Inez, looking into Khaled's eyes, noticed that he clearly had no idea she was coming. At that moment, Khaled understood why the name Eldrin sounded familiar to him. Dejada's Dion appeared in front of Inez, who greeted the guest and expressed great respect, and was glad to see them. Marquis Asdian himself also welcomed the lady to his property. Mrs. Asdian asked how her dear guest had arrived. Inez thanked Dejada's Dion for the invitation, but her family bothered her a lot because they constantly insisted on marriage, no matter how many times she refused. When Dejat Asdian took Inez's hand and brought it to his lips, Inez's ability immediately activated, and she saw how poor Dejat was trying to overcome her refusal of the engagement, although it was obvious to her. Marquis Asdian also introduced his eldest son, whom he believed Lady Inez Eldrin should have heard of. Turning to Khaled, Inez immediately had a smile on her face. She was happy to meet such a famous person. Khaled Asdian greeted the guest like a gentleman and also kissed Lady Inez Eldrin's hand. Upon touching Khaled, Inez's ability became stronger, and she also saw that he was shocked by the circumstances of his engagement to Inez. Inez shuddered at Khaled's reaction. She did not understand why he was not happy with the engagement to her. It was like winning the lottery. After entering and sitting at the table, Mrs. Asdian immediately started the conversation with questions to Lady Eldrin, because she considered the arrival a positive response to marriage. According to Lady Asdian, her son Dihad is a worthy groom, who even composed a song about how he wants to marry the lady. At that moment, Khaled calmly drank tea and listened to how Dihad was praised. And the topic of the engagement, as well as its date, was touched upon more and more. But Inez, with a serious face, announced loudly that she would first like to talk about something. Since they agreed in their opinion, Inez suggested skipping the engagement and going straight to the wedding. Dihad was delighted with this proposal, and if Lady Eldrin didn't mind, he would marry her immediately. Looking at the pleased Dejat, Inez annoyed him by saying that she would not like to get engaged to him, but to his brother Khaled. Upon hearing such a declaration, Khaled was surprised. He looked at Lady Eldrin with surprised eyes. It was as if he had fallen into an abyss and heard nothing but engagement to brother Khaled. The story of Khaled Asdian was sad. He was left at the door of an orphanage immediately after birth, and his unhappy life began here. He was lucky when he was adopted, but a few years later, his adoptive parents had a son and, as a result, he spent his childhood almost alone. Every day was like a battle. While eating, while walking, even when going to bed, he had to be constantly on guard. Throughout all the years of misfortune, Khaled learned humility, but the only thing he could not let go of was his sword. He really liked fencing. He fought adversity, blood, and then earned a place in the detachment of Imperial Knights. But misfortune decided to laugh at him. Khaled became the owner of the magic sword by pure chance. After which he was immediately sentenced to a limited life. His fate was predetermined. He was pursued everywhere by looks full of contempt and fear, the betrayal of the one he trusted most. In the year of life allotted to him, he has to achieve a lot. And one day Khaled accepted this fate. Mrs. Asdian, upon hearing Lady Eldrin's proposal, was very surprised and laughed embarrassedly. She hoped she had heard correctly. But with a confident voice, Inez repeated that she would like to get engaged to Khaled Asdian, the eldest son of the Marquis of Asdian. Without suppressing her emotions, the Marquis Asdian jumped up from his chair and loudly and nervously began to recount rumors about his eldest son, that he brought misfortune. Inez warned the Marquis Asdian that she was aware of these rumors, which is why she wanted Khaled to become her fiancé. Since she likes misfortunes, Everyone at the table sat dumbfounded. They couldn't even imagine that everything could turn against them like that. And at that moment, Lady Eldrin turned to Coyote and asked him to give her a minute of his time. Going out into the garden, Ines noticed that Coyote kept his distance from her, as if he was afraid of her. Stopping abruptly and turning around, Ines said that nothing could be changed in this situation. To which Coyote reacted surprised. Ines asked Coyote why he didn't go to his armory, because she was waiting for him there. And she was also interested to know if Coyote managed to try that special stew. Upon hearing this question, Coyote was surprised because he had incredible luck once when he entered the shop a little earlier. He managed to get the last stew. Having offered to take a walk and talk, Ines wanted to tell Coyote why she had come to him. Ines' most exciting question was whether Coyote had a lover. Upon hearing this question, Coyote was a little confused. He did not understand why she was asking such things. Noticing that Coyote was embarrassed, Ines offered to think for him, but then he immediately replied that he had no one. Ines realized that everything was going according to her plan, and looking him in the eyes, she invited Coyote Asdian to meet with her. Upon hearing such a proposal, Coyote was even more surprised, looking at Ines with a blank stare. And surprised, not understanding what this lady was plotting. But Ines clarified her proposal a little, saying that they could pretend as if they were lovers. Because she had no great desire to get married. Looking into Coyote's eyes, Ines explained that everyone wants her to get married. But she doesn't like to live according to the expectations of others. That's why she invited Coyote to pretend to be her lover, but he was more interested in why him. And no one else. Ines explained by saying that he had beautiful eyes and that it was her favorite color. But it wasn't just that, he met all her criteria. Looking at Kajad, Ines thought that he was not delighted with her, because it would be completely unpleasant if a fake lover really fell in love with her. Approaching Kajad and extending her hand to him, Ines told him that she could give him what he needed for his normal life. And peaceful. When Ines took Kajad's hand, he began to tell her that he had already tried all methods and means. There was no result. He wanted to understand how Lady Ines would help him, because if she contacted him, then misfortunes would also befall her. And maybe even death. But Ines was not one of those timid ladies, looking with her bottomless eyes directly into Coyote's soul. She warned him that perhaps she was not like others. When night fell and Coyote returned to his chambers, his sword Tigrias began to comment on the previous day. He especially liked watching the annoying Dijat. Tigrias also talked about Lady Ines, who clearly doesn't have everything at home, because no one would have thought that she would offer a fictitious relationship. And that she likes misfortunes. Hearing all this, Coyote understood that if he had the opportunity to hand over the sword, he would have gathered dust somewhere in a warehouse a long time ago, because the fact that they could communicate was their big secret. The sword was very interested to know if its owner would accept Lady Ines' proposal, since it would be good to have a lover and get rid of misfortunes. But Coyote immediately replied that he would refuse. Coyote understood that she was rich and beautiful, and he was the owner of a demonic sword. Unhappy and mortally ill. There was no benefit for Ines, and that's why Coyote had suspicions of deception on the part of Ines. At the end of the conversation, Ines warned Coyote that she could not wait forever for an answer. And even then, Coyote's sword suspected something, and now that they were alone, he warned his master that the lady had some kind of ability. The next morning, sitting in her office, Ines, reading the newspaper, was glad that she had recovered her ability, although temporarily, and had managed to close several deals that began to bear fruit. But then, putting the newspaper aside, Ines thought that several days had passed since her visit to the Asdian house. And at that moment, she hadn't even planned anything like that. And now, remembering Kalo Dizdaon, she understands that there is no better candidate for a fake lover than him. He has the right status. He is the eldest son of a family that has no power. Ines was also glad that he was not interested in her, but she also felt ashamed of his reputation, which left much to be desired, and moreover, for owning a demonic sword. Having thought about everything that had happened before, Ines understood that judging by the fact that there was still no answer, Kayod Asdian planned to reject her offer. If this suddenly happens, Ines will explain to Kayod why he will have to accept her offer. Because the misfortune she saw when meeting Dayhat was very interesting. Although Ines understood that once the news spread throughout the capital, Kayod would not be able to refuse her offer. Seymour entered the office. In his hands, he held the letters that arrived today. Ines was surprised by such a quantity because there were more than usual. Seymour explained to Lady Ines that most likely such a large number of letters was due to the rumors spreading in the capital. And Ines was very surprised when she heard this. It turned out that the news had already reached the people that Lady Ines was engaged to the owner of the demonic sword. And everyone began to discuss this. Shammer looked at the pile of letters and said that she sorted them as always and that most asked about the engagement. But taking one letter in her hand and handing it to Lady Ines, Shammer added that it came from the Count. Ines was surprised and snatched the letter from Shammer's hands, beginning to open it quickly. And unevenly, because for her it was not only the Count, but her beloved grandfather. When Ines began to read the letter, her soul immediately felt warmth and a pink blush appeared on her cheeks. The grandfather was interested in how his granddaughter was, and also said that his health had improved a lot, and that he would return in a year. After reading her grandfather's letter, Ines looked at the remaining letters and asked Shammer if there was any letter from her beloved brother Halo. Shammer, with a smile on her face, reminded the lady that she received a letter from her brother 2 days ago. But for Ines, it was an eternity. Pleasant memories flooded Ines, because after her mother's death, it can be considered that Halo took care of her. And they began to trust each other more. Ines told Shammer an old story about how, while walking in the garden with Halo, he walked on tiptoes. Ines worried about her brother and asked him why he was walking like that. Halo, looking her in the eyes and without hesitation, replied to his sister that he was afraid of accidentally stepping on an ant. Then Ines realized that her brother was a true angel, who would be very surprised to learn about the situation he had gone through. But he wanted to explain in person. Shammer took the letters from the table and wanted to tell the lady about the market research for the beauty industry that she had requested a little earlier. But at that moment, the butler knocked on the door and entered, informing the lady that a message had been received from the academy stating that the young master had gotten into a fight. Upon hearing this phrase, Ines immediately asked the butler who dared to touch her brother. But he corrected the lady by telling her that the young master had defeated his opponent. At that very moment, the office door opened and Kylo appeared in it, with wide surprised eyes. And with a single question, is it true that his sister is getting married? The Priscilla Academy is a very prestigious place that attracts talents from all over the empire. But even there was an outstanding one. And it was Halo Eldrin. He got the highest score upon admission. He looks like an angel, a kind guy from that same Eldrin family. All the students at the academy were discussing Halo, suggesting that only in appearance was this boy kind. And he had an angelic face. Just 6 months ago, sitting in Ines' office, Halo told her that he did not want to go to the academy. He was afraid that his friends would make fun of him for entering the academy late. But Ines warned Halo that he could tell her everything, and she would solve the problems. Halo was also worried about one more thing: he would have to live in a dormitory. And he couldn't sleep anywhere else except in his room. But Ines was ready to solve this problem, saying that she would arrange everything like in his room. Looking at his sister, Halo understood that studying at this academy was very expensive. But Ines did not feel sorry for her brother. Even if he had studied his whole life, he wouldn't have spent even a fraction of her savings. But now, when Halo was at the academy and heard rumors that his sister was getting married, and even to the owner of a demonic sword, his state was extremely depressed. Halo wanted to check everything personally, but he didn't have the opportunity to leave the academy. Since the holidays were far away and he had spent all his free time. Suddenly, one of the academy students called him and handed him an envelope with a request to deliver it to Mrs. Ines. Taking the envelope in his hands and looking at his interlocutor, Halo, with a calm face. He asked why he had to deliver this trash and who he thought he was to call his sister by her name. The boy was in shock and could not contain his emotions. Raising his voice, he began to explain that he simply asked to deliver the letter. And Halo turned out to be very rude. It was as if Halo was deliberately dragging the boy out and continuing to say that he would not allow such an insignificant person as him to approach his sister. But the boy also decided not to remain silent and began to say that Halo's character is worse than ever, and that he pities Mrs. Ines for having a younger brother. With a distressed look, the guy continued to provoke Halo, telling him that if he wanted to hit him, then the academy could suspend him for such a thing. Halo realized that this would be an advantage for him and that his problem would solve itself. Raising his hand clenched into a fist, Halo, with a satisfied face, told his interlocutor that he would help him get home. And he hit. After a couple of minutes, Halo was in the director's office, listening to sermons that there was no place for violence within the academy walls. And they were forced to send him home to reflect on his behavior. On the way home, Halo thought it was just rumors, but when he returned to the capital, everyone was talking about it. And standing in front of his sister, he asked if it was true. Ines, looking at her brother, was surprised how Halo found out about the marriage while he was at the academy. As Halo explained, the rumors had already reached the academy and everyone was discussing the marriage with the owner of the demonic sword. But Ines reassured her brother by telling him that she was not planning to have a husband, but a lover for her own personal purposes. Looking at Halo, Ines continued to tell him that she had no intention of starting a serious relationship, and that therefore he could be calm. Halo understood everything, but for greater confidence, he decided to clarify that as soon as his sister recovered her abilities, she would immediately separate and receive a positive answer to this question. When Halo exhaled in relief, his face immediately changed and he decided to apologize to Ines for shouting, because he got emotional after hearing the news. Ines also told Halo that she could barely stop herself from going to the academy after learning that her beloved brother had gotten into a fight. Halo decided to talk about that boy from the academy who constantly insulted his family. But no matter how offended he was, he realized that there was no need to resort to violence. Looking at Halo, Ines admired him and said that her brother could not be a bad boy. And in general, how could such a person appear in such a terrible world? When Ines realized that Halo had hit her with his fist, she immediately asked how his hand was, and if it was worth calling a doctor, but her brother calmed her down by telling her that he had hit lightly. Once calm, Ines asked Halo to tell her everything next time, and that she would solve the problems so that he wouldn't have to use his fists. Halo listened to his sister and agreed, but suddenly decided to ask a very strange question. Does Ines have problems from the other side? Ines' face changed upon hearing the question, and she became emotional. She understood that by the other side, he meant Marquis Herberet and his new family. She immediately replied that it was not from his side and asked Hilo the same question. But he also replied that, while studying at the academy, they practically never clash. But Ines already had many questions in mind. Who is trying to get close to Halo? The Marquis Herberet himself, or his father's illegitimate son, has the free sister really entered the Marquis's family? All these thoughts disappeared after an unexpected knock on the door. Shammer approached and opened the door, and informed the lady that a message had been received from the guards about the stolen jewelry. Ines realized that she had taken the bait, apologized to Halo, and told him that she needed to leave for a while to take care of her future lover. Standing under a beautiful flowering tree, Kayad contemplated the landscape. Suddenly, in the distance, he notices the silhouette of a girl approaching him with a sweet smile on her face. Khalad begins to sweat cold and realizes that this is the same dream that has not allowed him to sleep peacefully for many nights. Getting out of bed, he sat down to read the latest newspaper. His sword was glad that the owner had already woken up, and decided to invite him for a walk with that same rich young lady in such good weather. The newspaper only wrote about Ines Eldrin. The sword immediately realized that she was rich enough. And this was a 1,000,000-to-1 opportunity for his owner, so he began to explain to the owner that this was the best offer. And Kalot could leave the detachment of knights. But Kalot seemed to ignore his charge and only said out loud that he would soon need to go to work. As he was preparing to go to work and leaving the house, Madame Asdian called Kalot. And he turned around. Behind him was the annoying Mrs. Asdian, and the excited Marquis Asdian said that Dihad was in trouble. He explained that recently Dihad had been depressed and started drinking excessively. He met a guy who asked Dihad to do him a favor for 3 gold coins. But when Dihad arrived at the designated place, the guards met him and asked him to hand over a precious stone that had been stolen from the Eldrin family. After hearing the whole story, Kalot said it was time to go to work. But Marquis Asdian interrupted him by saying that they had already sent the man to the imperial palace. Kalot didn't understand anything at first, but then Marquis Asdian added that they had taken sick leave and asked to take over Dihad's case. Kalot seemed to have failed after these words. With a mysterious face, Lady Asdian suggested asking Lady Eldrin to be lenient with this situation, since she personally visited Kalot and could hear him. Kalot abruptly turned around and repeated once more that he was going to work, and that he had nothing to do with Lady Eldrin. But after him, the Marquis Asdian and his wife began to speak indignantly, saying that they did not raise him like that, and that for him work was really more important than family. After this sentence, Kayod understood that only in such moments they are a family, but in life he was never treated as a family member. But in the end, the Marquis Asdian asked Kayod if he really wanted to be kicked out of the family. Kayod understood that if he was expelled from the family, he would have to leave the Order of Imperial Knights, in which only representatives of the nobility serve, and if he also refused the position of captain, he would have nothing left. Discouraged, Kalot agreed to try, but he did not promise them anything because he was not sure that Lady Eldrin would listen to him. Getting into the carriage, the sword was indignant the whole time about some idiot from Dihad. But Kalot only thought that, having solved this problem, he would immediately get to work. Upon arrival at the place, Kayota was immediately greeted by a guard who demanded that the young man present himself, or they wouldn't let him go anywhere. Having taken out his badge as captain of the Imperial Court Knights, Kalad was immediately allowed to pass. And he opened the door in front of him where Dighat was. Dighat was sitting in the small room with handcuffs on his hands. He shouted and asked for them to be removed, saying that they did not know who they were dealing with. Upon entering the room, Dighat immediately noticed Kalad and asked with disgust if his parents had sent him. Because Dighat expected someone more respected, but resignedly ordered Kalad to resolve everything quickly here. Upon hearing Dighat's order, Kalad reacted with a smile and began to walk towards the center of the room. When suddenly, behind Kalad, a door opened and Lady Eldrin entered, looking very calm. Turning around and noticing Lady Eldrin, Kalad thought that she did not look like someone who had something important stolen and precious. But after a couple of minutes, Kalad Asdian realized that it was all a trap. And Lady Eldrin used Dighat to lure Kalad. When Dighat noticed Lady Eldrin and blushed a little, he greeted her with great respect. Looking at her guests with her blue eyes, Iniacute said she neither expected nor thought they would meet exactly like this. Dighat, not listening to her, shouted that he was innocent. Iniacutes began to confront him with the fact that Dighat had arrived at the transaction site with an item stolen from his family. But Dighat kept shouting that they had asked him for a favor, and he didn't know what the item was. In a whisper, slightly covering her face with her hand, Iniacute said that only an idiot in this world would agree to fulfill an order without checking the merchandise. Lady Eldrin first invited everyone to sit down and discuss the problem that bound them with a thread. Kalot looked at Lady Eldrin suspiciously, and at that moment, his sword told him that this young woman was a very good cover. When everyone was seated at the negotiation table, Lady Eldrin was the first to speak. She said that the stolen jewels were worth more than 2 million pearls, and upon examining them, she noticed several scratches. Dhat, as if he were that idiot, began to offer his service to Lady Eldrin as revenge. He also recalled his feelings for her, and that, until now, he only thought of the beautiful Lady Eldrin. When Kalat heard the nonsense Dhat was talking about, he wanted to slap him on the head. Because it was Kalat, who was embarrassed by his idiot brother. At that moment, Ines looked at Kayat with a very penetrating gaze, but Kayat had thoughts and memories of a conversation with Ines running through his head about how she asked him to pretend to be her lover. Dhat, with an anguished look and like the last psychopath, continued talking about marriage and about the great husband he would be for Lady Eldrin. Kalat couldn't stand it and ordered Dhat to shut up, explaining that such disrespectful behavior was unacceptable. And the idea of hitting him, Dhat crossed his mind to bring him to his senses. I looked at Kalat with a surprised look. Dhat asked him why he was preventing them from communicating, and why the hell he should even listen to some Kalat. These words were the last straw for Kalat. Slamming the table with his fist and raising his voice slightly, he announced that he was Lady Eldrin's lover. Hearing these words from Kalat, Dhat was speechless. He looked at her with such surprised eyes, hoping it was all a bad dream. Ines was happy at that moment because Kalat had agreed to her proposal, and for that she explained to Dhat that when someone speaks to her lover like that, their mood worsens. After such words, Dhat looked at Lady Eldrin with an anguished expression and continued saying that during his visit to the Asdian mansion. She and Kalat decided to go out, thinking about the engagement. Having regained some sense, Dhat could only utter one sentence. No agreement had been reached on the matter of the engagement. Ines realized she had nothing more to discuss with Dhat, stood up from her chair, and started leaving the room. But suddenly, the distressed Dhat began to shout and ask Lady Eldrin to stay for at least a moment. Turning around, Ines said only one sentence. If something like this happens again, they will meet him in court. And they left. Upon going out to the street, Kalat also followed her. Only one question tormented him. Is it true that Lady Eldrin organized all this? But Ines had answers to all the questions. She explained that she knew in advance what Dhat was going to do. And she took advantage of it. Kalat really didn't like the answer. Or rather, he was interested in one phrase Lady Eldrin said. That is, she knew in advance. So Ines had to tell Kajad everything, who has a special ability, and can see the misfortunes that will befall the person he touches. Hearing this, Kalat hesitated a little, because he couldn't even imagine that such an ability existed in the world. Ines joked with Kajad, calling him an expert in his abilities and inviting him to tell her a little more about what he might know. Lady Eldrin decided to tell Kalotas Dion her story, that due to this ability, she suffered and her parents didn't believe her and stayed away, believing she would bring them trouble. Because seeing other people's misfortunes is not normal. After this, Ines decided to live her life alone, without marrying, but at her current age it is difficult to be single. Although on the other hand, no man can become her lover. When Lady Eldrin told Kalat her secret, she hoped he would keep it, since their destinies were similar. After hearing the whole story, Kalat was a little saddened and now couldn't understand if the conditions offered by Lady Eldrin were too favorable for him. Ines couldn't admit to him that to her, he was the goose that laid the golden eggs, and even more so. She wasn't sure if she would finally be returned after contact with Kalat. It started raining outside. Ines opened her umbrella and hiding her and Kalodum under it. She said she does nothing that doesn't bring money. Kalat also took the umbrella and agreed, and told Lady Eldrin that he would become her fake lover. At that moment, Shammer appeared behind Ines, who whispered in her mistress's ear that because of this weather she might catch a cold. Without thinking for long, Lady Eldrin invited Kalotas Dion to continue the conversation at her house, where they could discuss all the details. Meanwhile, in his room, Halo, in a hysterical state, tried to vent his anger by hitting the pillow with his fists. Repeating the same thing, why did Kalod Asdian become his sister's lover? Exhausted, Halo simply collapsed on his bed. He understood that even though it was a fake relationship, he couldn't understand one thing. Why Asdian? Because now he had more enemies. Lying face down on the pillow, he spoke about how difficult it was for him to protect his sister from that woman. And the old man almost every day. Halo remembers the rumors and gossip about his father and his illegitimate sister. People couldn't understand how the mistress's daughter could be older than her own son. And it turned out that his own daughter and son entered the family of Count Eldrin, who was their grandfather. But the problem was that the Count was on the verge of bankruptcy. But things were going well for the Marquis, and his illegitimate daughter gained status and enough money. Moreover, his father's illegitimate daughter often wrote to Halo and invited him to be friends. Because she was very happy to have a younger brother, and in every letter asked him not to tell his sister Ines about this. But for the moment, Hilo understood that his illegitimate sister, Ronnie Herbert, was not the main problem he wanted to deal with Kalod Asdian before returning to the academy. Sitting on the bed, Hilo knew that Kalod was the unluckiest man in the world, and that he could do anything to his sister. With anguished eyes, Hilo was thinking of a plan to quickly return strength to his sister and force her to quickly separate from this guy. The next day, sitting in her office and filling out documents, Ines mentally reviewed yesterday's conversation with Kalod. Because she didn't believe he would accept her proposal so easily. But Ines was very happy with his decision, as otherwise she would have had to resort to blackmail. And besides, she didn't lose money, since she had substituted the jewels with a fake one in advance. Ines understood that this would be beneficial for both. She would recover her abilities. And the unluckiest man in the world would avoid misfortunes that perhaps wouldn't make an ideal couple. There was also a very interesting moment of reflection. Ines thought about why Kayat became the heir to the Asdian house. Despite being the eldest son, he was adopted, and the Asdian family was very indifferent to him. Shammer entered the office with very important information for the lady. She finally identified the people who contacted Mr. Halo. It turned out that among them was Ronnie Herbert, who sent the letter. Upon hearing this name, Ines' face changed. She was very interested in knowing for what purpose Ronnie wrote the letter to Halo. Ines was determined and couldn't wait to meet Ronnie Herbert by any means necessary. But Seymour had also prepared for this. He took an invitation for Countess Bridget, who was hosting a tea party today. Because Rainey Herbert was on the guest list, after which Ines canceled all her plans. At that moment, at the house where Miss Bridget lived, a message was received, which was announced by the maid entering the room to the guests, and saying that the invitation from the lady had received a positive response from the lady. Ines of the house of Count Eldrin. Miss Bridget was surprised and ordered a reply letter to be sent immediately. Meanwhile, Ines was already on her way to the tea party and looking out the carriage window. She thought about how much time had flown since her last meeting with Ronnie. Ines remembered their first meeting, in which Ronnie smiled so innocently as if she didn't know the circumstances of their parents. She was surprised every minute. Even while sitting at the table, she said she had never tasted that food. Even then, Ines understood that Rinnie was pretending to be pathetic and playing some kind of game of her own. For Ines, these were very bad memories, as her father stole a lot of money from her mother. And Rinnie spent it extravagantly, and when her mother was expelled, her illegitimate sister moved into the mansion. And bothered Ines and Halo. Every time her father gave gifts to Ronnie, she thought that Ines also received a gift. But that was not the case. On the way, Shammer informed the lady that last month Lady Ronnie celebrated her coming of age. Ines understood how much time had already passed. Ines remembered her youth, because when she found out that after the expulsion, her mother was sick. She returned under the Count's wing and had no time to worry about Rane. Ines had to worry about the family. And money. Anger and resentment remained in Ines' heart until now, she perfectly understood that time does not heal all wounds. Ines wondered why she didn't touch Rennie. Obviously, it wasn't forgiveness. She was just waiting for the moment, but Ines couldn't even imagine that Rennie would contact Halo. And this moment has come when it is worth giving a warning. The guests gathered at Miss Bridges were discussing Mrs. Ines and the fact that she would attend today's tea party. When suddenly the door to the hall opened and Mrs. Ines Eldrin entered, all the guests looked at her with huge, bright eyes. When Ines entered the hall, she immediately apologized for being late and greeted all the guests with a sweet smile. Miss Bridges immediately jumped up from her seat. Her excitement was very noticeable. She also greeted Mrs. Ines and asked her to come to her table. Ines, approaching them, thanked Miss Bridges for the invitation and said she was very happy to read her invitation letter. Rennie, sitting at the table, also greeted her sister with a smile on her face. And she remembered how long it had been since they last saw each other. Miss Bridges invited her guest to sit next to her because for her this was very important and exciting that evening. Suddenly, Rennie accidentally catches a teacup and it flies off the table to the floor, followed by Rennie's sighs and apologies. Excited by the situation, Miss Bridges asked everyone to wait just 1 minute, because the tablecloths and chairs would be replaced immediately. But Ines didn't pay much attention to this whole situation and said she would sit opposite Miss Calzone's, because from that angle, the lady's profile looked better. After these words, Miss Bridges began to shine like millions of stars in the sky, having already forgotten about this spilled teacup. When Miss Bridges sat down in her place, she began to talk about how the next day she hadn't even thought that Lady Eldrin would join them. And for her, it was like a waking dream. Ronnie carefully caught every word she said. The girls also couldn't help but talk about how much they write in the newspapers about Lady Eldrin and how incredible she is. Ines smiled sweetly and listened as one after another praised her for her well-styled hair, the outfit with which she decided to attend this event today. Ronnie couldn't hold back for long and decided to say that she had also heard a lot about her sister. And she was very happy for her success and her business that was going uphill. But Ronnie wouldn't be the same if she hadn't remembered the address ship that sank, reminding her that Ines had invested so much money in it. And at that very moment, Ronnie advised Ines to invest in the Tillet ship next time, because her father had invested in it and made a good profit. Listening calmly to all this and drinking tea, Ines said she never invests large sums. To which Ronnie reacted very excitedly, because according to her information, 5 million prels were invested in the ship. Ines told Lady Ronnie that she had already forgotten about it until she reminded her, and that 5 million is not such a large amount. Ronnie, trying to sketch a sweet smile, asked Ines to address her simply as Renai, because the lady's treatment was too cruel for her sister. And they were members of the same family. Hearing this, Ines immediately said that they were not members of the same family, and that she never had a sister or a father. After such a declaration, Renai jumped up from her seat and warned Ines that if her father heard this, he would be very angry. But Ines repeated once more to Lady Renai that Marquis Herbert was nothing to her. Lady Ines also added that Marquis Herberty was deprived of parental authority due to non-payment of child support, since he claimed he had nothing to pay. Ronnie was very embarrassed because her sister was humiliating her father in front of other girls. Lady Ronnie's feelings were greatly affected, and therefore, she confronted Lady Eldrin because she was speaking too harshly about her father. But Ines, calmly drinking tea, continued to explain to Lady Rainey that Marquis Gerberty was not her father, since even animals take care of their offspring, and Ines could not consider someone worse than an animal as a father. Bowing her head and looking innocent, Lady Rainey said in a very sad voice that she only wanted to be friends with the family members, even though she had a different mother. Hearing all this nonsense, Lady Eldrin remembered how Lady Ronnie was trying to contact Halo without her knowledge. She clearly wants to have a younger brother who looks like an angel, because Ronnie is used to taking the best for herself. After Ines thought about Halo, she became very cautious because she could not allow Lady Rani to play with him as if he were a doll. Standing up and walking towards Lady Rani, Ines placed her hand on her shoulder and warned her that if she wanted to play family games, she should go elsewhere. Ines leaned close to her ear and whispered that if she suddenly found out about Halo's next letters, she was afraid to even think about what she would do to Lady Rani. Then, turning to Miss Bridges, Lady Eldrin apologized and informed her that due to the situation, she had to be the first to leave the event. With a very sweet and affable smile on her face, Ines thanked Lady Bridges for the incredibly delicious tea, and in return invited her to visit her. Upon hearing the compliments and the return invitation from Lady Eldrin, Miss Bridges was completely delighted. And she was already looking forward to the meeting. Preparing to leave and saying goodbye to the other ladies, Ines looked at Lady Rani again because she already knew what would happen to her in the future. During the conversation, placing her hand on Lady Rani's shoulder, Ines saw a rather amusing misfortune in which Rani said she wanted exactly the dress she didn't get. While Kayat was sleeping, he had the same dream he had been having for a long time. Waking up suddenly, Kayat had tears rolling down his cheeks and realized that in this dream he was constantly waiting for only one person whom he didn't even know. And when he woke up after this dream, he always cried. All thoughts about Kalota were interrupted by the sword with its question about whether its owner would meet that same lady today. Khalad thought about it because Ines had asked him to see her when he had free time. And today was his day off. But Khalad still didn't trust her and treated her with caution. After meeting and heading to Lady Eldrin's house at the entrance, Khalad examined this large white house. And his sword warned him not to miss such a girl. Upon arriving at our house, the sword explained to the owner that this was paradise for them, and offered to stay with this sweet and very intelligent lady for her age. Getting out of the carriage, Khalad asked his sword to be quiet and going out to the street. Bowing, Khalad said he had come to Lady Eldrin. But on the porch of the house, Khalad met Halo with a very serious face. He informed Mr. Khalad Asdian that his sister had left. Without hesitation, Khalad said that in that case he would stop by next time. But Halo was very serious, heading towards the entrance of the house. He invited the master to chat and have tea until his sister returned. Khalad looked at Halo and understood that brother and sister are birds of a feather, because they don't listen to anyone. Entering the living room and sitting down to drink the tea offered to him, Khalad took a sip and realized that he was drinking salty black tea. The servant had confused sugar with salt, he thought, and continued drinking. All this was observed by a serious Halo, who couldn't understand why Khalad Asdian was silent, and said nothing. In the end, it turned out that Halo deliberately added salt instead of sugar, but Kayat understood that worse things had happened to him than this small misunderstanding. Halo started the first conversation by asking Mr. Khalad if he knew how popular his sisters were, and that difficulties could arise if they pretended to be lovers and then accidentally fell in love. In a very calm voice, Khalad replied to the young master that this would never happen. But Halo jumped off the sofa and, hitting his chest with his hand, shouted that he would always be in first place. When suddenly he heard a question behind him: what were they doing here? Turning around, he saw his sister, who had already returned home after an important matter. And Ines, pleased, praised Adjalo for entertaining the guests while she was away. Ines, looking at Kayad, clarified the fact that she has a very cute little brother. And she asked Adjalo to return to his room and rest. Sitting opposite Khalad, Ines admitted to him that she did not expect such a quick meeting. And when she learned about the unofficial meeting with Halo, she returned immediately, abandoning all her business. Khalad informed Lady Eldrin that he had sent a letter in advance, in which he wrote about his arrival. But then he thought that most likely the lady had some problems, because she had received a reply letter. Despite all these small problems, Ines was glad that Khalad had arrived. And she offered to discuss what they couldn't talk about before, placing some documents on the table. She wanted to clarify some points, and for that she handed Khalad a contract in which it was written that Ines Eldrin. and Kalat Asdian would enter into a contract and become a couple. The contract would last for 1 year. Holding this contract in his hands and reading it over and over, Kayod was a little confused. He reminded Iniakutes that maybe a year would not pass. But Iniakutes calmed him down and explained that for now they would stop at 1 year, and if neither party died, then they would extend the contract. Then Iniakutes decided to list the subclauses of this contract, which were that during the contract they are forbidden to have other lovers. Everyone tries their best for the relationship to appear. Ines Eldrin assumes all costs, and Kalat Asdian protects Iniakutes from other men. Iniakutes also prescribed one of the equally important points, that physical contact is only possible by mutual consent, and that holding hands is possible without prior consent. The most important and final point was that it is forbidden to have feelings for each other. And looking with her bottomless eyes, Iniakutes told Kayod not to fall in love with her. After hearing all the points and understanding them, Kayod told Iniakutes with complete confidence that he promised to fulfill them. I handed my pen to Kayod. Iniakutes asked him if he wanted to add anything to this list, and if he agreed he could sign it. But suddenly, when Kayod took the pen from Iniakutes, he accidentally touched it. And then her abilities worked, and she was shocked by what she saw, because she learned that her goose would die in a week. All this should happen in his own room. When Kao is sleeping, assassins will break in and commit their terrible act. Iniakutes couldn't believe that nothing had even started yet. But it could end so quickly. Kalad noticed that something was wrong with the lady and decided to ask what happened. After a few minutes of silence, Iniakutes told Kalat the misfortune that would happen to him. That in a week assassins would enter his bedroom. In a state of shock, Iniakutes unintentionally dropped her pen. But Kalat didn't even raise an eyebrow at what he heard. He just replied that this happens to him often. Iniakutes looked at Kalat with wide eyes and couldn't understand if the assassins had already attacked him. Then he admitted to Iniakutes that after becoming the owner of the demonic sword, the number of threats increased, and he thought that Igfrid's followers were involved. Iniakutes had never heard this before, so she was interested in hearing what Igfrid is. So, Kalat began a story about the deity that most countries on the continent worship. It was the power of the high priest and the great temple, as well as the divine power that could be seen with your own eyes, this gift that Igfrid gave to the earth. The divine tree. This tree was very large. It seemed to touch the sky, and its roots spread across all the lands of the continent. The sacred tree was the incarnation of life, something that shared the destiny of the continent's peoples. But one day, the demonic sword Tigrios damaged the tree. After Kaod's story, Iniakutes understood her visions and why everyone was trying to kill him. Because when his death came, he would feel relief. But another question worried her: why didn't the temple take him away? But Iniakutes decided for herself that until she fully recovered her ability, Kaod could not die, even if he really wanted to, and she decided to tell him that nothing would happen to him. Kalad was surprised, because he thought that after his story Iniakutes would change her mind. He reminded her once again that if she continued to date him, sooner or later she would be in danger. Smiling slightly, Iniakutes said that if she was in danger, then the empire would be too. Since the empire's economy would collapse, and the country would be in a very uncomfortable position. In a short time, Iniakutes had already devised about 10 ways to stop the assassins and invited Coyote to listen to them. Piercing Lady Eldrin with her gaze, Kalat was already talking about her bad reputation. And it was thanks to him that Iniakutes would also hear something bad directed at her. But Iniakutes hurried to reassure Coyote because many people spoke ill of her. And that has no longer been a problem for her for a long time. Then, having calmed down a bit from her visions, Iniakutes explained that it was impossible to please everyone and, moreover, no one else was talked about as much as her. Iniakutes, with her bottomless blue eyes, looked into Kajad's eyes, which burned with a fiery fire, and asked him if he had any more questions, to which she heard a negative answer. And now, with complete confidence, Iniakutes offered to sign the papers. Coyote, picking up his pen from the floor, put his autograph under all the listed points of the contract. Immediately after signing the contract, Ines suggested that her lover buy rings to look like a real couple to others. When they arrived at the jewelry store, for some reason, it was only there that Coyote wondered if it was too early for rings. But Lady Eldrin reminded them that in order not to arouse suspicion, they would have to buy them. Ines admitted to Kajad that for other people, their relationship might seem like a surprise and generate a lot of negativity. Looking at Kajad with a sweet look, Ines asked him how he was doing with the acting, to which he replied that he had never tried this type of activity. She noticed some excitement in his eyes and suggested that he simply repeat after her. And everything would be fine, because they couldn't act like strangers while going for the rings. Upon entering the jewelry store, all the consultants immediately ran towards the beautiful couple and greeted them. The girl, with a smile on her face, noted that Mrs. Eldrin hadn't seen her shop in a long time, and immediately asked what she could tell them. The prompt Mrs. Eldrin replied that she would like to look at the rings, or to be more precise, wedding rings. The expression on the girl's face immediately changed. She decided to clarify again if she had heard anything about wedding rings. But approaching Kalat even closer, Ines repeated that they needed matched rings whose quality this sweet girl should have taken care of. Then the girl immediately offered to see her new collection and asked her to follow her. Approaching the display case with rings, the girl told and showed the models that were recently made and that are popular right now. While looking at the rings, Kalat noticed a very interesting ring from a very famous jeweler. Approaching the display case and looking at it even better, Kalat suddenly heard his sword, which said that he should take this particular diamond ring, because even if his owner breaks up with this lady, the ring will remain for him, and the diamonds cost a lot of money. Closing his eyes and being patient, Kalat thought how good it would be to sell the demonic sword to some flea dealer and buy a ring with the proceeds. But his internal state was suddenly interrupted by Ines, who asked for his opinion on the ring, pointing to the same one with a bunch of diamonds that Kalat had been looking at a few minutes ago. When Coyote replied that it was a good option, Ines immediately took the ring and began to put it on Kajad's ring finger. Taking the second ring, Kajad also put it on Ines' finger. At that moment, she watched everything that happened with a very sweet look. While filling out the documents, the girl said they could engrave the inside of the ring. Ines liked this idea. She agreed and began to dictate her first and last name, and then the chosen ones. But when she heard the name Kajad Azdian, the girl immediately became nervous. Ines, looking at the girl, asked her if any difficulty had arisen, but the surprised girl replied that everything was fine. And she asked to wait for the master and the mistress, and that they would do the engraving immediately. Sitting on the sofa, they were served drinks. Ines, looking at Kajad, asked him to try the drink. Without asking a single question, Kajad silently took the glass and began to taste the contents. But after taking a small sip, his face changed. All this time, Ines watched him with great interest, and noticing his first sip thought that Kalat would put the glass down again. But most likely, he liked the content. Taking his glass in hand and starting to drink, Ines knew that it was common apple juice and ordinary, and that if Kalat continued to drink it, then he liked apples. After finishing the juice and sitting a little longer, a girl with rings approached them and told them that the engraving was ready and they could go pick up their order. After putting on the rings again, Ines and Kayad headed for the exit. And all the consultants bowed to such important clients, thanking them for choosing their store. Just before leaving the store, Ines whispered to Kalat that journalists were waiting for them outside, and that when they went out, he would have to put his arm around her shoulder. Kalat listened to all of Ines' demands, and when they left the jewelry store, he immediately put his arm around her shoulder, because that way her ring could be seen much better. Movingly, Ines also showed her hand with the ring, thinking to herself that now the whole empire should know. The journalists were shocked by what they saw. They tried to write down every word said by Kalo Dastian and Ines Eldrin. Meanwhile, Emperor Carey's Gerald Venetian was at home drinking tea, staring at the empty sofa in front of him. There was another cup of tea on the table, or rather, his favorite magnolia tea. Looking at all this, Carey's remembered her appearance and her sweet smile, like a child's. He heard her pronounce his name with tenderness and love. When the butler entered the room, Carey's asked about the crown prince, to which he heard in response that he had gone hunting. The butler also decided to tell new rumors that say that the eldest daughter of the Eldrin clan intends to get engaged to the owner of the demonic sword. But it turned out that the emperor learned about these rumors in the morning and was a little surprised that a family that in just a few years had gone from misfortune to shocking. The entire empire. Although he was more surprised that the chosen one was the owner of the demonic sword. Carey's remembered the very day when everything happened. That day, the butler burst into the meeting room with the news that the owner of the demonic sword had been chosen. Carys at that moment was in complete peace and was waiting for what the butler would say next. He began to say that the sword that appeared for the first time in 100 years was chosen as its owner by a member of the Imperial Knights Order. Suddenly, after hearing the information, one of the meeting members slammed the table with his fist and asked with an indignant voice how it was possible that the owner of the demonic sword was a member of the Imperial Knights Order. He was furious because they could not entrust the protection of the imperial family to the chosen one of the cursed sword. So he only offered one option, which sounded like exile. But other members of the meeting also stood up to defend Khalad Azdian, saying that he would not leave the Imperial Knights Order and that this was already decided. But no one could understand who made such a strange decision, when suddenly it turned out that the high priest had decided so. Someone suggested that Khalad Azdian remain in the order, but if something happens, the temple will take responsibility. But still, someone was very worried about this, and with all their discontent. They said that if all responsibility falls on the temple, then they cannot refuse the high priest's request. And they transferred Kayat from vice-captain of the 1st detachment to captain of the 3rd detachment. Finishing his tea and reviewing the whole story in his head, Carys understood that all this was done for his safety, since the 3rd detachment operates outside the imperial palace. Looking at the painting hanging on the wall, Carys understood that everything happened because of his curiosity. At that moment, Ines, sitting in her office, admired the new decoration in her hand, thinking that she finally got what she wanted. After several days have passed, and the whole capital has been turned upside down by the news. The newspapers are still full of articles about the relationship between Ines Eldrin and Khalad Azdian. Ines estimated that in about a year, Khalad would be taken to the temple, and after that he would not marry for at least several years, because he would become a grieving widow. But the great mystery for Ines remained the fact why the temple gives the owner of the demonic sword a break. Because sooner or later misfortune will befall him. For Ines, the most important thing was to recover her strength, but for that she still needed to maintain contact with Khalad and hold on to him until the end. Shemer, a little agitated, entered the office with a tray in her hand, on which was an envelope with frozen green wax seal. Remembering that this month was the emperor's birthday, Ines reached for the envelope and accidentally touched Shamer's hand. And then Ines saw how Shamer was indignant with a potato head. There was also useful information that Ines learned that the mine would cease to be profitable. After everything she saw, Ines looked at Shamer with a very sweet and kind look. She realized that Shamer also runs around and is the only one who treats Ines so well. Without thinking much, Ines ordered Shamer to get rid of the southern mines. A little bewildered, Shamer reminded the lady that negotiations in this regard had progressed a lot. With a satisfied face, Ines said it was a bad investment and warned Shamer that she would be absent for a while. When the carriage was ready, Ines went to meet Khalad. She wanted to inform him of the imminent misfortunes, but there were only 3 days left until the day of his death. Approaching the meeting place, Ines thought about her plan, for which everything was already ready, because no one could invade her goose. Getting out of the carriage, Ines saw Kayod, who was soaking wet from head to toe. But rain was not predicted at that moment. Approaching Kayod, she clarified what had happened. While trying to comb his hair, he recounted that on the way to a meeting, someone poured water on him. Already calmed that nothing serious had happened, Ines suggested that Kalot change clothes first, and they headed towards the store. Ines decided to consult with Kalot about how his last few days had gone. It turned out he didn't see that they sprayed him. Suddenly, Ines pulls Kalot towards her, and a huge vase of flowers falls from the upper floors. Ines excitedly asked if everything was all right and if he was hurt, but in her head, she understood that he could have died before the assassins attacked. Looking around, Ines accidentally placed her hand on Kayod's chest and learned that after his trip to the store, there would be a fire. Then Ines understood why he is called the unluckiest man in the world. Because a flower pot almost fell on his head, the road was closed for repairs. And besides, he was almost run over by a loaded cart. Kayod offered to finish all the plans for now, but Ines was serious and warned him that if he went alone, he might fall under the wheels of some carriage. When they arrived at the store, Ines quickly packed a couple of suits, because while the store didn't burn down, everything would be fine. Having delivered Kayod's things, Ines warned him that she would be waiting for him outside, and that he should change clothes quickly and come out. While waiting near the fitting room door, Shammer whispered to the mistress that she didn't expect him to be such an unlucky person, because with such success, her mistress could be in danger. But Ines told Shammer that she was ready for something like this. She was just surprised that what was happening went beyond her imagination. Looking back at the fitting room door, Ines thought how nice it would be if they could choose the misfortunes that would fall upon their heads. Then, abruptly approaching the fitting room, Ines began to worry why he hadn't come out in so long. She started knocking on the door and asking Kayod if everything was all right. Not hearing an answer, Ines ordered Shammer to bring a hammer, but after this phrase, Kalot replied that he had a small problem. Ines immediately started receiving many questions about what happened. Opening the fitting room door and looking from behind, Kayod reported that his buttons had come off. Looking at Kalot, Ines noticed the beautiful and lively body that the consultants had. They were surprised to see such a handsome man. Realizing this, Ines immediately approached Kalot and reminded him that he could only appear in front of her this way. After giving Kalot a new shirt and holding the fitting room door, Ines, a little embarrassed, asked the girls to count them. When the girl reported the amount, Ines extended a check for an amount greater than the final one. Looking at the mistress, the girl understood that these were very dear customers of her store. After getting ready and leaving the fitting room, Kalot looked stunning. The suit Ines had chosen for him was perfect. Looking at Kayod and biting her lower lip slightly, Ines realized that she had the most beautiful goose in the world. Ines also had plans to change Kayod's hairstyle, but there was no rush. As they were preparing to leave, the girls in the store started running and shouting that there was a fire at the entrance of the store. When Kayod and Ines met on the street, people had already started whispering about the fire. Someone said it was caused by lightning striking the store sign. Looking at the sky, Ines did not notice a single cloud or any sign of lightning. Then Ines realized that her ability to foresee the misfortunes of others was not omnipotent. And she could not see what did not make another person unhappy, nor could she control phenomena such as lightning. Drawing conclusions from everything that was happening, Ines realized that Kalot could die or be injured as a result of a natural disaster. Behind Ines was Molesto Kayot, who informed her that most likely the fire was caused by him, warning her that if luck was not on Ines' side, she could get hurt. Kayod asked her only one question about whether she still wanted to be his lover. But Ines, looking him in the eyes, replied that lightning could strike any other day. Kayod asked her if she really thought all this was a coincidence. Ines was sure of this and was indignant that Kayod always blamed himself for everything that happened, although it was a real coincidence. Then Ines realized that every time something like this happened, people blamed Kalot for everything. Because it was much easier for them. Moving away from him, she dared to suggest that this might have happened because of him. Because lately she had been unlucky, citing the example of a ship in which Ines had invested a large sum of money that sank. But a fire broke out while cooking. Then Ines, taking Kalot by the arm, suggested that he change the situation and not get so melancholic. Walking and continuing hand in hand with Kalot, Ines saw that she still hadn't been able to try that same apple pie, although she had already visited this bakery several times. With an intriguing look and calling him Sir Kalot, Ines asked him if he liked apple pies. Without any enthusiasm, Kalot replied that he didn't like them much, but he would like to try them. Then Ines told Kalot that they sell delicious apple pies on 12th Street, and that you can walk there and have a snack. After a couple more hours, Ines returned to her house late in the evening, where Halo was waiting for her. Getting out of the carriage, Halo immediately asked if his sister had a good time. With a smile on her face, Ines replied that everything went well. Hilo, satisfied, calmed down after his sister's answer and told her that he would come with her on vacation, after which Ines stroked his head. But when Ines took her hand away, Hilo noticed the ring shining on his sister's finger. And his face changed. Realizing this, Ines worried and thought that her brother was not feeling well. But Hilo said he was worried about not being able to properly greet the guest. Leaning on Halo's forehead, Ines calmed him down and told him that next time everything would be fine, and that he shouldn't worry about it. In a good mood, Halo sat comfortably in the carriage, waving his hand out the window, and shouting to Ines that he would soon return to her. In response, Ines also waved her hand to Halo and told Shammer how cute her little brother was. To which Shammer replied that the young master was indeed very kind. But Shammer's thoughts were that her mistress would never know that her brother became an angel only with her. When Halo left, Ines' gaze fell on the garden, and then she invited Shammer to have tea there. Because it had been a long time since there were such beautiful evenings in the garden. Shammer immediately went to prepare everything for tea, and Ines decided to take a walk in the garden at sunset, remembering her mother and how happy she would be to see such support. Ines seemed to return for a moment to that very day when, sitting by her mother's bed, she told her that lately she had been taking care of everything herself, and that when her mother felt better, they would take a walk together in the garden. Little Ines promised her mother that she wouldn't have to walk through a weed-covered garden, and that the flowers would bloom very soon, so she asked her mother to open her eyes. Every time she remembers that day, Ines thinks that if she had acquired her ability earlier, her mother would be sitting next to her now. Ines felt guilty and promised herself that she would succeed at any cost without fear or doubt. She decided to use her power to protect her loved ones and dear ones. As Ines walked, Shammer had already prepared everything and called her mistress to the table, on which there was not only tea, but also apple jam and cake. Having eaten this apple jam, Ines remembered Kalot at the establishment where they tried the apple pie she had wanted to try for so long. Having tasted only a piece, Ines offered to pack the cake herself, to which Kalot agreed. And then he looked like a cat that had caught the desired fish. Sitting in the garden, Ines reviewed the day they went for rings. Kalot then drank plenty of apple juice, which means he likes apples. Ines thought, thinking that a week has already passed since they entered into a fictitious relationship. Kalot still has doubts and keeps his distance. This may be because Ines perceives him as a goose and not as a man. That day, while eating apple pie, Ines brought up the topic of a murder that was going to happen in a few days. Then Ines asked Kalot to do what she asked, because Ines promised him that his hands would not get bloody. And sitting in the garden, Ines realized that today was the day they were supposed to attack Kalot. Heading to the house, Kalot remembered Ines' demands that after work he had to go straight home, refuse dinner, and behave as usual so that no one suspects anything. Kalot thought about the first date where nothing serious happened, as he himself was neither hurt nor caused any harm. He even got to taste the apple pie he had so desired. For the first time in his life, Kalat felt so calm. He wanted everything to be like this. But he couldn't wish for too much. Upon arriving at the house and getting out of the carriage, thoughts of a wonderful evening. And calm did not leave him, because Kayat's body would soon be taken to the temple. And everything would end. From all these experiences, Kalat spontaneously began to twist the ring on his finger. And then he remembered the charming blue eyes that shone like an endless sea. The light ash-colored hair that enveloped Ineakutes. Kayat thought that Ineakutes would start asking him for something as soon as they entered into a fictitious relationship. But none of that happened. Even despite the misfortunes that happened to him, Ineakutes did not run away from him. Approaching the doors of his chambers, Kalat began to think that he simply did not know exactly how they were using him. After making himself comfortable in the chair, Kalat was served dinner, which Ineakutes had asked him to refuse. Without thinking much and taking the plate, Kalat threw the dinner from the balcony into the garden. Then he left the dishes outside and completed his nightly chores as usual. Ineakutes' next order was for Kalat to lie down and rest, and keep his sword nearby just in case. Literally, a moment later, assassins burst into the room, surprised that Kalad Asdian was not asleep. They were warned that Kalad Asdian would be given sleeping pills during dinner. But apparently someone made a mistake. The gang leader calmed his charges and told them that regardless of who owned the demonic sword or not, Kalad Asdian was an ordinary person. Raising his sword and shouting at Kalad Asdian to die, she began to attack. Suddenly, at that moment, 4 more people with swords and masks appeared in the room. Stopping, the main assassin asked the others why they had come, if they also wanted to kill the owner of the demonic sword. But since they arrived first, they will do it. But the leader of the 4 said that they didn't care who was first, because their goal was completely different with a swing of his sword. He slit the throat of one of the assassins. Seeing all this, Kalad could not understand what was happening. The sword asked the owner why they were fighting among themselves. After 2 minutes, all the assassins were disarmed and killed. The leader of the 4 approached Kalad and told him he could sleep soundly, because they themselves would clean up what they messed up. Kalad's hand still held the sword, who had many questions for the owner. Where the assassins of assassins came from. Kalad looked at them and could only ask who sent them, to which he heard the long-awaited answer that it was Mrs. Eldrin. And only then did he remember her words that she would be careful not to get her hands bloody. The next day, Ineakutes had already completed a single transaction from which she made quite a profit. Lately, Ineakutes began to feel that her abilities had become stronger than before. And the area of misfortunes she could see had increased. But she still hasn't figured out how to maintain her abilities without Kayat. But when he saved his goose's life, there was plenty of time to think about this topic. Approaching the carriage, Ineakutes asked Shammer what her schedule was. Shammer reminded her that the lady was having lunch with Duchess Helios today. After getting into the carriage and moving on for business, Shammer asked the lady if she would be present at the banquet for His Majesty's birthday. With a mysterious smile, Ineakutes thought about attending this evening with her partner, because there is no better place to introduce Kayat than the Imperial Palace. Looking at the ring, a brilliant plan occurred to Ineakutes when she introduced Kalad. She would no longer have to bother with explanations. But when Ineakutes goes to the banquet, she will meet people she doesn't usually see, and whom she would not like to see. Ineakutes asked Shammer if her dress from the Rubizanon salon was ready, to which she heard the answer that it would soon be finished. Delighted with what she heard, Ineakutes thought about rewarding the salon employees for their hard work. Meanwhile, Ronnie Herbert, celebrating her birthday, listened to the guests' praise for her necklace that her father gave her. Hearing Lady Rainey's praise, she remembered that same tea party when Ineakutes said unpleasant things to her. And no one took her side. Even after Ineakutes left, everyone treated Lady Rainey as if she weren't there. While all the girls talked and laughed, Lady Rainey was lost in thought. She had to make sure that there were people on her side too. When Lady Rainey received gifts and compliments, she understood that everyone at the festivity loved her. And they were also on her side, but clenching her fists so tightly, Rani wished that Ines would also feel the shame and the humiliation she experienced that day. Rani also remembered that several years ago, they all lived together in the Marquis's residence. But when her mother got sick, they took Halo away, and Rani was sad about not being able to contact him. And when she got him, Ines humiliated her in front of all the girls and even tried to threaten her. Reni didn't understand why Ines limited her communication with her younger brother so much. Most likely, Ines feared that Reni would get closer to Halo, because Ines's jealousy was still there when she was jealous of Reni's father. After thinking about all this, Reni decided to return to the conversation with the girls. They were already talking about Mrs. Eldrin, who should get engaged to the owner of the demonic sword. But suddenly, the topic changed drastically, and the girls were already asking Lady Rani if she would attend a banquet at the Imperial Palace. To which they heard a positive answer. The girls were very interested to know if Lady Rani had chosen a dress for herself. But she told them she was looking at fashion houses. The other girls were talking about Ruby Sanon's house, as it turned out that almost no one was allowed to enter. And they would all like to wear her dress at least once in their lives. Upon hearing this, Lady Rani was very surprised, because she couldn't even imagine that it was so difficult to book a spot at this fashion house. Hearing this, all the guests immediately thought that Lady Rani had ordered her dress there and, envying her, they asked her to take them next time she was there. In the end, it turned out that Lady Rani had to beg her mother and father for a long time to get the chance to reach Ruby Sanon. When they finished their meetings and Lady Rani dismissed her guests, she thought that she had only received permission from her parents, but that she hadn't placed an order yet. Getting into the carriage, Lady Rani asked to be taken to the elegant house of Ruby Sanon. She is the only daughter of Marquis Herbert, and if she doubles the price, they will definitely accept her order. On the way to the fashion house, Rani thought about the rumors about Ines' engagement and the owner of the demonic sword. She perfectly understood that they were just rumors because her half-sister was proud and vain. She would marry an old man with money and status. Upon arriving at the fashion house, Rani noticed that it was closed and got a little annoyed. Getting out of the carriage and approaching the girl at the entrance, Rani told her that she had come here to order a dress for the banquet. But in response, she heard that the fashion house was no longer accepting orders. So Rani decided to act differently, starting by saying that she was from the Herbert family and that her order was very important. But the girl at the entrance apologized and explained to the lady that they were now forced to refuse even His Majesty the Emperor. Reni began to get angry and say that they should cancel other orders and accept her, because she would pay several times more. But she heard a negative answer. So Reni pushed the girl and started entering the fashion house. And in her head were thoughts that she had already boasted to the other girls. But in the end, she couldn't order a dress. A dazzlingly beautiful dress that she could only dream of shown before her. Pointing to it, Reni said she was buying this particular dress, but the girl told her that dress was not for sale because it was custom-made. Reni shouted at the entire fashion house that she would pay handsomely for it, or she would speak to the client personally. And she would ask for the girl's name. The girl told Lady Rani that this beautiful dress was custom-made for Mrs. Ines Eldrin. Rani's face changed. She understood that this dress cost as much as a complete set and that she could not afford it. Seeing this dress, with such delicate work, Rani asked to call the designer immediately. But the girl explained that Madame Eldrin had sent all the house employees on vacation. Meanwhile, Ines, standing by the window, saw a carriage approaching with Kayod in it. And she was very happy that he arrived on time. When Kayod entered the house, he was a little surprised that only Ines greeted him. And then he asked where Halo was. Satisfied, Ines replied that her younger brother had returned to the academy, so today it would just be the two of them. As he walked up the stairs, Kayod asked Ines if he should really go to the banquet. After all, everyone will hate him if he shows up, and Kayod also admitted that he had never been to similar events. Ines stopped and looked at Kayod. She couldn't understand how such a majestic man had never attended such events. Kalat explained to Ines that in crowded areas, the probability of emergencies occurring is much higher than on a normal day. But Ines reassured him by telling him that she would be with him and that he shouldn't worry about it. When the door to the room opened, Kalat was startled by what he saw. This was not expected. Entering, he saw a large number of different costumes and more. Kalat began to understand for whom everything was prepared. While Kalat looked around, Ines settled comfortably in a chair and announced that they were starting. Trying on everyone's outfits had already lasted more than 2 hours. Ines ordered the servants which clothes to serve Kalat. Tired and exhausted, Kalat asked Ines to stop, as he could no longer bear it. Ines didn't understand why Kalat didn't like it, because if there was no clothing here that he liked. She suggested finishing for today and coming back to use it in the morning. After hearing this, Kalat turned silently and endured all this harassment even longer. Since his new hairstyle was decided, Ines suggested keeping it long, but making the bangs shorter. The servant immediately got to work and began to comb the thick black hair to Zabash, trying to comb it as the mistress ordered. Sitting in front of Kayad, Ines watched all this and waited for the final result. When everything was ready, Ines approached Kayad and pulled out a couple of strands of hair, adding that even his face had turned pink after all the changes. Having asked for a mirror, Ines thought that now with it she would not be ashamed to appear anywhere. When Kayad took the mirror and began to look, his sword also decided to speak, saying that normally the owner looks like an average resident of the country, and today he looks like a young man from a rich family. While Kayad examined his reflection, Ines' gaze fell on his sword, and she offered not to take it to the banquet. But Kayad refused, since if the sword was not with him, he could die. So Ines offered to decorate it too, and upon hearing this, the sword was happy that he was also going to the banquet. Out of so much joy, the sword even moved a little. Ines, looking at it, realized and asked Kao if this was so, and the sword added that it could still speak. And she nicknamed it Brulik. Ines was a little embarrassed, because she thought she had gone crazy and was already imagining things. And Kayad, looking at her, was glad that Ines did not hear the demonic sword. Then Ines ordered the sword to be decorated with a ribbon and asked Kayad if it was possible to touch it. He replied that everything was fine and possible, and the sword told the owner that it would allow Brulik to touch it. Then, making a beautiful bow with ribbons, Ines tied it to the demonic sword. The sword asked its owner to show it in the mirror. Kalat, without hesitation, took the mirror and positioned the sword as she wanted. Ines watched what was happening in surprise. When everything was finished, Ines informed Kalat that he could dress like this for the banquet. But she asked him to come early in the morning, as there were still many things to finalize. Ines also confronted Kalat with the fact that she would take all the clothes and accessories he tried on today. Kalat looked at this large amount of things and asked Ines why. To which she replied that everything was made according to his measurements, and these things would not fit anyone else. But Ines also added that if he didn't like this trial format, next time she would just buy a store. And they would meet there. Approaching Kayad and touching his hand, Ines wanted to see what misfortune awaited him next. The butler burst into the room, saying that a problem had occurred, and said that Marquis Herbert had arrived, immediately asking how this man got to the estate. To which the butler replied that Marquis Herbert burst in and ignored the guards. Kalat looked at Ines and didn't understand what was happening, but she apologized and asked him to wait a little, as an uninvited guest had arrived. Ines went to the first floor of the house, thinking how good it was that Halo returned to the academy, and how the Marquis dared to show up before her. Waiting for Ines downstairs, there was an angry Marquis who scolded her for making him wait. And then he began to talk about his success in investments. Ines looked at these two and was disgusted with them. She asked the Marquis why he had come here. In a serious and forceful voice, he said that he should hand over the dress that Ines had ordered from Ruby Sanon. Hearing such a statement, Iniakutes was stunned as this man, who did not attend his wife's funeral, showed up before her for some dress. Modest Rennie stood behind the marquis and told him that his sister could give him the dress, or at least give her the chance to order it. The marquis ordered Iniakutes to send back the fashion house employees on vacation if she couldn't give up the dress. To which Iniakutes replied that the marquis himself could bring the employees back. With a smile on her face, Iniakutes explained that even if he brought the employees back, it was unlikely they would accept the order, and added that the marquis was still too simplistic in everything. This further enraged the marquis, who began to shout at Iniakutes and tell her that she had no right to speak to her father like that. But Iniakutes said that there is no father here, only a man who abandoned his children because he didn't want to pay alimony. And this man could afford a ruby Xanon dress. After these words, the marquis became furious. Raising his hand and about to hit Iniakutes, he shouted that she was a terrible, impudent woman. Suddenly, Callot appeared behind Iniakutes, who grabbed Marquis Herbert's hand and asked him what he was allowing himself. The furious marquis asked the young man who he was to interfere in others' family matters. Callot replied in a serious voice that he was Lady Eldrin's lover. Beating his chest with his hands, the marquis shouted that he was her father and that she could not have anyone more important. Shammer and his guards, who were ready to kill for her, rushed to the lady's aid. Iniakutes, without the slightest doubt, ordered the guards to expel the uninvited guests from the house. When the guards began to do their job, the marquis tried to resist, telling them they had no right to do this to him. As Iniakutes was about to leave, she only said one thing, that the count's security was disgusting, and that if this continues, merchants will soon start visiting them. Shammer lowered his head and said it was his fault. The marquis shouted at him that their conversation was not over and that he would find a way to finish it. Stepping out onto the street, where there was total silence and the wind blew through Iniakutes' hair, she invited Kayod for a walk in the garden. Kallad asked Iniakutes if she did the right thing by intervening, to which she replied that he arrived at a very opportune moment. While walking, Iniakutes looked at Kayod because she didn't even think he would defend her. Then she began to tell Kayod that this was her biological father and that the girl with him was her half-sister. Looking around, Iniakutes' thoughts focused on one thing. The marquis was willing to visit one of his daughter's houses just because the other couldn't buy a dress at a famous fashion house. Iniakutes still remembers the very day she asked her father to help her mother. And he replied to this little one that at that time, it was difficult to cover all the treatment expenses. He also accused her of running away from home with the Count of Eldrin, although the marquis tried to stop her. Then Iniakutes, sitting in the snow, heard the most terrible words, that if she ever left the estate again, the marquis would not consider her his daughter. These memories will remain forever in Iniakutes' head, and now she asked Kayod not to worry about her personal problems. And she promised him that this would not happen again in the future. But Kayod warned Iniakutes that if this man appeared again, she must inform him. And then he would arrest him on the spot. And then Iniakutes realized that no matter how much Marquis Herbert kicked, he couldn't behave as he wished in front of the commander of the Imperial Night Detachment. And now he would have more problems. Walking silently in such beautiful weather, Iniakutes supposed that Kayot wanted to know a lot about her family. But he remained silent, but suddenly the silence was broken and Kayot asked about the banquet and what he had to do. After this question, Iniakutes began to speak in detail about her actions, that when they appear at the evening event, all attention will be only on them. There is no need to talk to everyone, and that is why she asked Kayot to only focus on her. Looking into his burning eyes, she asked if Sir Kallod was ready to become her beloved lover. The long-awaited evening arrived. Many guests were already at the ball and were discussing the sensational news about Lady Eldrin's engagement. And Kallod Asdian. Everyone was tormented by the question of why she gave preference to the owner of the demonic sword. People said all sorts of things, and that's why various rumors appeared. Like Kallod Asdian is a murderer, or some consider him cursed. Then, seeing the young Asdian, the girls decided to ask him about his older brother's engagement, and if it was true that Lady Eldrin personally visited his property. Hearing the questions, Dihad was disgusted, because he was already mortally upset by what was happening. And she kept talking about her bastard Bart. But he replied to the girls that Lady Eldrin really visited their estate, and he was unsure about the rest. And he could assume that rumors about their separation would soon emerge. Dihad expected their separation, because this bastard was like a leech in his family. It is obvious that his parents were commoners, and now he is the successor to the family. But Dihad was not bothered, because soon the bastard would be taken by the temple. Then he told the girl about his brother's terrible temper, and that he wouldn't be with Lady Eldrin for long. Excited, Dikhat said that Kalat is his older brother, but sometimes Dikhat doesn't understand him. Because Kalat is always sad and doesn't know how to get himself together. Suddenly, a beautiful and lovely couple entered the hall of the imperial palace and attracted the eyes of all the guests. Dikhat also turned around and couldn't understand which young man Lady Eldrin had come with. But he looked very familiar. Walking along the path, Iniakutes only heard praise in her direction about her beautiful dress from Ruby Sanon. And the young man she smiled at so sweetly. It was a shock to the guests, because Lady Eldrin rarely showed her smile. But here she was smiling, and even at a man. Iniakutes began to whisper in Kalat's ear that they should stay closer to each other. And she asked him to put his arm around her waist. Without the slightest doubt or unnecessary questions, and if necessary, Kalat put his arm around Iniakutes' waist and pulled her close to his body. The guests at the ball began to approach the beautiful couple to express their best impressions of how dazzlingly beautiful Lady Eldrin is today, and to get to know the young man better. Iniakutes told the guests that this young man was her lover, and they tried to keep the relationship a secret. But since rumors spread quickly, they decided not to hide. One of the guests was even glad that the engagement with the owner of the demonic sword was just a rumor. And then Iniakutes decided to show all her cards, introducing her lover as Sir Called Asdian, adding that they were not officially engaged yet, but the rings had already been bought. The guests couldn't believe what they were hearing and seeing, because the owner of the demonic sword was really standing in front of them. And the rumors about their engagement turned out to be true. One of the guests approached the couple, after hearing this, and asked Lady Eldrin if everything was all right with her, explaining that something could happen to her because of the owner of the demonic sword. But Iniakutes had quite a sharp tongue, and replied to the young man that none of them should expect anything to happen to her. Then Iniakutes saw Rani enter the hall and realized that she, as always, appeared last as the protagonist to attract as much attention as possible. Lady Rani looked around and was a little confused because she didn't understand what kind of strange atmosphere there was in the hall, and if there was really no one here who recognized her and came up. But turning around, Lady Rani saw her half-sister with a young man she had seen at her house. And when their eyes met, Iniakutes realized that today's banquet would be very entertaining. The music sounded, and it was announced that His Majesty the Emperor had arrived. And as he walked through the hall towards the throne, all the guests bowed deeply to greet him. Kalad, with a serious face like all the other guests, bowed to His Majesty. But in his heart, he felt very uncomfortable and awkward. Walking along the carpet and noticing Kaladastian, His Majesty the Emperor even stopped. He looked him up and down and continued walking. Iniakutes thought that despite his blonde hair and blue eyes, His Majesty saw Kayod in him. And she also wondered why the Emperor was so surprised to see Kayod at the banquet, since he had also received an invitation. Sitting on the throne, His Majesty the Emperor proclaimed glory to the Venetian Empire and thanked everyone for being able to find time despite their busy schedules. The butler told the guests that today their duchy had specially selected 100-year-old pearls for His Majesty, the Emperor's birthday. And they also presented wine from the best grape varieties of their empire. The representative of holiness also presented a gift to His Majesty the Emperor. I will extend to His Majesty a branch of the sacred Yigfried tree to bless and protect Venecian. His Majesty the Emperor was pleasantly surprised by such a gift, and asked for words of thanks to be conveyed to His Holiness. Seeing the branch of the sacred tree for the first time, something began to tighten in Iniacute's chest. And she had the feeling that it was calling her. Iniacute looked around and wondered if everyone had this feeling, or maybe that's why the tree is called sacred. The representative of holiness turned and began to pierce Chaod with his gaze. Iniacute noticed this look and appreciated it, as if measuring how much life Chaod had left. But then Iniacute saw the heir to the throne and looked him in the eyes, thinking that it would be good to establish a connection with the ruling family as a businessman. Although Iniacute understood that most of the ruling family was rude, and decided it was better to avoid the prince as much as possible. Returning to Chaod, Iniacute decided that now that everyone remembered her, she could leave. Because they came here to show off with her lover, and not to get close to other people. Iniacute asked Chaod if he wanted a drink, but he refused this offer. Then Iniacute imperceptibly pressed her finger on Chaod's chest, hinting that his answer was incorrect upon realizing that Chaod immediately agreed with Iniacute's proposal. When guests approached Lady Eldrin to discuss some business matters, she replied that her dear lover was thirsty, and that was why they were leaving. While they were alone in the hallway, Iniacute offered apple juice to Chaod because he liked it. But Chaod replied that he didn't seem to like it much. And when Iniacute suggested replacing the apple juice with wine, Chaod said it wasn't necessary. And he took the glass from Iniacute's hand. Then Iniacute was convinced once again that Chaod liked apples. And he simply didn't want to show his weakness. But their sweet conversation was interrupted by Duchess Helios, who asked Lady Eldrin how she was, and if she had enjoyed this evening. Iniacute was a little surprised, and replied that everything was fine for her, asking the Duchess in return if she was having fun at the ball. Suddenly, the Duchess's face changed when she saw the owner of the demonic sword. And she asked Lady Eldrin to give her a moment, kissing Chaod on the cheek. Iniacute told him she would be back soon and asked him to wait a little. When Iniacute left, Chaod placed his hand on the cheek where Iniacute kissed him, remembering a day of his happy childhood. That day, while sitting at the dining table, Chaod accidentally touched Dijat. She didn't like it, and Dijat asked her mother to seat him somewhere else. But his mother made a different decision, telling Chaod that he would now eat in his room. Chaod kept his hand on his cheek and wondered if Iniacute didn't find him unpleasant. Standing to the side, Chaod continued to wait for Iniacute, but suddenly the sword informed him that Dijat's henchmen were heading towards him. And the sword was not mistaken. 3 young men came up with the word that they got excited when they heard about the owner of the demonic sword. But they found out that Chaod was nothing on his own, and who was he anyway to be with Lady Eldrin? Chaod looked at them with an unflappable gaze, and the sword told the owner that these guys were just jealous of him, because his brulic was very popular. They continued to say that Chaod simply bribed Lady Eldrin to please her, assuring him that this would not last long due to the fact that he brings misfortune. But suddenly, the sword felt that Dijat was also heading towards them and suggested hitting him in the face once, and then run away. Dia stood in front of Chaod and told him that it doesn't matter if he is the commander of the knights or anyone else, Dias will overcome him and crush his calm here and now. Then Dias began to talk about what his family had lost because of a bastard like Chaod. But their problems would be solved when they took him to the temple, and he should leave Lady Eldrin alone so as not to cause trouble. Chaod moved even closer to Dias and proposed an experiment to see if his misfortune could be transmitted to someone else. Taking the demonic sword in his hands and handing it to Dijat, Chaod said how fun it would be if they weren't happy together. And Dijat became the next owner of the demonic sword. Dijat's people fled in fear after such a proposal, and Dijat himself panicked. Promised Chaod that they would discuss this situation at home. The sword was indignant at this owner's proposal, but Chaod explained that if they started a fight, then he was obliged to do something similar. Duchess Helios asked Lady Eldrin about the man she came with. If it was true that he was the owner of the demonic sword, Iniacute nodded silently. Then Duchess Helios told the reason why she called Ines. She wanted to discuss a deal, but suddenly they heard some kind of confrontation. And the Duchess supposed that someone was not getting along. Ines also looked around and wondered who had such audacity to come to such a place and start fights. Who has no manners? But seeing Callot and the crowd of boys, Ines couldn't believe they were talking about her goose. Ines' eyes lit up. Because if something bad happens, it will really be talked about for a long time. So, Ines suggested to the Duchess to postpone this conversation for next time. Unless, of course, there was some urgency. The Duchess felt uncomfortable realizing that she was delaying Lady Eldrin too much. But Ines reassured her by telling her that she was simply worried about Callot. These words greatly surprised the Duchess, as she supposed that Ines entered into a relationship for some reason. But it turned out that Callot's Dion was really not indifferent to her. After such words, Ines realized that the Duchess was very intelligent. But she admitted to him that she herself did not believe she could fall in love so much with someone as to go crazy. So Duchess Helios did not dare to stop Lady Eldrin and handed her over to her lover. Returning excitedly to Callot, Ines immediately asked him what had happened. But Callot replied that everything was fine, and then Ines suggested going out to the terrace for some fresh air. Stepping out onto the terrace and looking into the void, Callot asked Ines if she regretted anything, since she herself saw very well what people thought of him. But for Ines, such a reaction was expected. She was more concerned about why Callot was so insecure, or if he wanted Ines to leave him. But this was impossible. Ines encouraged Callot by telling him that he did a great job and that it was better to look crazy than kind. And that she did not regret it at all. On the contrary, she was glad that Callot accompanied her to the banquet. Throughout the night, Ines realized that people were afraid of Callot. So the number of those spreading rumors will decrease after today's banquet. Looking at Callot, Ines admitted that she had no reason to be the first to break the contract, although she still didn't understand what bothered him so much. Clenching his hand into a fist, he asked Ines the only question: why was she doing this to him? Since he understood that everything was a game. Ines had many thoughts in her head. She didn't understand why Callot thought she couldn't be kind without a reason. And no matter how much Ines supported him, it wasn't enough for him. So Ines decided to confess and told Callot that he was her type. Running her hand through his hair, she explained that she was in love with handsome men, and that today he looked especially beautiful. And abruptly changing the subject, Ines said she had seen Dihad Asdian and asked him to tell her what happened between them. Reluctantly, Callot had to admit to Ines that when an argument arose, he had to say some kind words to Dihad. After this, Ines asked Callot if he wanted to move out of the Asdian house, because she could help in this matter. Callot, with a sad look, explained to Ines that if he left the mansion, he would have to renounce the Asdian family. And then he would become a commoner and could not be a member of the Imperial Knights Order. After hearing what she heard, Ines remembered her only trip to the Asdian house. And even then, she noticed that they treated Callot as if he didn't exist at all. The whole night passed before Ines' eyes, and she realized that everything had gone quite calmly. And even after their arrival at the banquet, a series of accidents had not occurred. Even after Ines kissed Callot on the cheek, nothing unusual happened. Approaching Callot, hugging him and getting closer and closer, Ines said she needed to make sure of something. Callot did not expect such an action and froze in place, and Ines understood that the scale of misfortune varies depending on the level of contact. But as expected, it would not happen without incidents. Suddenly, Callot abruptly pushed Ines away from him and asked what she was doing. Hearing in response that she was just trying to see the misfortune. Confused, Callot suggested doing this as before, simply touching hands without any hugging. But Ines seemed not to hear him and hugged him again, telling him that depending on the level of contact, there could be different misfortunes. Giving an example that she can see much wider and deeper if she holds his hand. And not just hugging him or if she hugs him like now. So Inuyakutes decided to invite Coyote to try touching lips to see better. Coyote pushed Inuyakutes away with a frightened look, saying that she had definitely gone crazy. He turned around and headed towards the entrance of the hall, telling Inuyakutes that he would bring them something to drink. Turning around and looking into the distance, Inuyakutes realized how nice Kalad was. He got scared and simply ran away. Hearing footsteps and turning around abruptly, Inuyakutes expected to see Kalad return. But an uninvited guest approached her. It was the prince who asked Lady Eldrin to grant him a moment of her time. Inuyakutes bowed and greeted His Majesty the Crown Prince. The prince admitted that he had heard a lot about Lady Eldrin, but saw her for the first time. He also asked if it was true that she was dating the owner of the demonic sword. Inuyakutes nodded her head. With a malicious smile on his face, the prince congratulated Inuyakutes, saying she was beautiful, but that he felt sorry for her. Inuyakutes did not remain silent, and replied to the prince that her lover was not a person who would calmly listen to such things. Although even for her it was too much. After apologizing and saying that he did not intend to offend her, the prince boasted that Sir Caladastian was his pride. Inuyakutes looked at the prince and noticed that he spoke as if he had looked towards the terrace by mistake. Although the curtains were drawn, and this already made it clear that someone was there. Leaning on the parapet, the prince began to talk about Count Eldrin, who had long since withdrawn from family affairs. And now everyone believed that Lady Eldrin had taken the place of the true head of the family. The prince said he was looking for young and talented people to help him, and that's why he invited Lady Eldrin into politics. He wanted Inuyakutes to become his political partner. But looking at the young prince, Inuyakutes expected to hear something completely different. But it turned out that he was already trying to strengthen his power. The crown prince was the only son of the emperor, and currently the emperor's authority is unshakable. No one seeks to fight him for power, so when the time comes, the throne will pass to the prince. But the prince decided not to limit himself only to political relations. He also invited Lady Eldrin to enter into a relationship with him. Inuyakutes was shocked by what she heard, as by relationship he meant the position of crown princess. But as attractive as the offer was, Inuyakutes didn't know what he was planning. The prince could use her and cast her aside. So Inuyakutes thanked him for such an unexpected offer and asked for time to think. The prince understood that the proposal sounded very unexpected for Lady Eldrin, and in this case, he gave her time to think. But he also added that if she rejects this offer, it will definitely not be in her favor. Leaving the terrace, the prince looked back and said he expected a positive answer. And he wished Lady Eldrin a good time. Taking care of him, Inuyakutes couldn't even imagine that her methods for attracting forces would be so radical that they would even use threats. Now she understood why she felt so unpleasant when their gazes met. Clenching her hand into a fist, Inuyakutes realized that she would have problems if the next emperor became her enemy. But she couldn't allow herself to be used, so she decided to touch him next time and find out his weaknesses. Meanwhile, Rini, while in the hall, realized that the banquet at the imperial palace she was attending for the first time in her life was different from her expectations. After all, she wanted so much to attract the attention of as many people as possible that she even appeared at the last moment. But everyone was busy with something else. Remembering how Inuyakutes left the hall, Rennie looked at her dress that was supposed to be for her. And also at the man next to her who is the owner of a demonic sword. Suddenly, Miss Bridget approached Rennie and whispered in her ear that she was afraid if the owner of the demonic sword suddenly went crazy. Moreover, Miss Bridget heard that he was ugly, but she would never have thought that he would actually be handsome. Ronnie, biting her lips, understood that the rumors about Inuyakutes' relationship with the owner of the demonic sword were true. But Miss Bridget was very worried about the question about Lady Herbert's dress. Yes, it was true that it was from the Ruby Sanon salon, because it was very different from what was sewn in the salon before. So, Rennie explained to the girls that this dress was from another salon, since at the Ruby Sanon salon. The employees accidentally ruined her dress, and she couldn't wear it. The girls were shocked by what they heard, but Rennie's plans did not include conversations with these ladies. She wanted to make a grand debut and surround herself with the people she deserved. Noticing Dastian, Ronnie went straight to him, without even apologizing to the girls for having to leave. Having caught up with Dastian, Ronnie greeted him with a sweet smile and looking at him. She realized that she could not control her emotions since she saw this man for the first time. And now she wanted to catch him. Callow admired Lady Ronnie with a blank look and simply remained silent in response. Lady Ronnie assumed that Sir Asdian did not remember her and began to talk about the mistake that had been made. And that her sister Iniacutes had misunderstood everything, so Ronnie wanted to apologize. Kalat asked why Lady Ronnie would like to apologize, and, embarrassed, she replied that she did not want to involve the young master in family disputes. In this case, Kalat Asdian suggested that the young lady apologize to Lady Eldrin. And not to him. Lowering her gaze to the floor, Rennie began to explain that Iniacutes was to blame for everything that day. Since she did not listen to her father's words, and the problem could have been solved calmly. Also telling Kayat that Iniacutes always caused nothing but trouble for the family. After listening to all this interesting story, and without giving any answer, Kalat said that in that case he would take care of his business. But suddenly, Lady Ronnie grabbed Kalad's hand and began to say that she didn't care who they thought he was. Even if he is the owner of a demonic sword, she thinks Kalad Asdian is a very good person. Having heard all this, Kalad looked at Lady Ronnie with a piercing gaze and asked her why she decided he was a good person and, in general, what she could know about him. Hearing all these questions, the surprised Lady Ronnie didn't understand why he reacted that way, since she thought she would touch him with her words. At that moment, Iniacutes was still on the terrace and was already beginning to worry about Kayad, because he said he would bring something to drink and come back. Iniacutes began to think that something might happen to him and peeked into the hallway. When Iniacutes saw that Ronnie was next to Kalat, she immediately approached them and asked them what the two of them were doing here. Looking back and noticing Iniacutes standing next to her, Ronnie hoped not to get into trouble just for chatting with Sir Asdian. Happy Ronnie greeted her sister with great joy, reminding her that they hadn't seen each other in a long time. Iniacutes was surprised to hear this and thought that Ronnie had something with her memory. And she reminded her that they had seen each other a couple of days ago, when she and the Marquis showed up at her house and demanded a dress. Iniacutes supposed that Ruby Sanon did not accept Ronnie's order. This statement was heard by the girls behind them, and they didn't understand what it meant. Well, Lady Ronnie told them she couldn't wear the sewn dress due to an error by the staff. These words hurt Ronnie a lot, and she told Iniacutes that she had placed the order. But there was a problem, and that's why she couldn't wear it. Iniacutes understood that these were pathetic excuses and decided to ask what Ronnie wanted from her lover. To which Iniacutes heard that Ronnie simply decided to say hello, since the last time she hadn't been able to introduce herself properly. Iniacutes took everything calmly, and just saying hello wasn't about Rennie. So Iniacutes said that everything was as expected, because blood is thicker than water. Hearing this phrase, Rennie was very surprised and hoped she had heard the truth. But Iniacutes insisted on her own, and said that Rennie reminded her of an unscrupulous woman who yearns to conquer another person's man. And she will not forgive destroying another person's family. Because of such insults, Rennie asked Iniacutes to be careful with her expressions. And Ronnie added that her status was much higher. But Iniacutes decided to simply trick Ronnie because she didn't even say who exactly she was talking about. And Ronnie was already nervous, and about Iniacutes' status, she said that now she could boast about it as she pleased. With a fan in her hands, Ronnie got angry and urgently asked Iniacutes not to insult her. Otherwise, it could end badly. Laughing, Iniacutes suggested that Ronnie go complain to Marquis Herbert again. This was the last straw for Lady Ronnie, and she threw the fan at Iniacutes' feet with the words that she was challenging her to a duel. A duel with a lady implies a sword competition between their representatives. And the loser must publicly apologize to the winner, and many spend large sums of money to hire a representative. Ines, without hesitating for a moment, accepted Lady Rani's challenge, warning that she would choose a location for the duel. Of course, Ines chose Kayod as her representative, and Rani had to report on her representative 3 days before the duel. A couple of hours ago, when Ines hugged Kayod on the balcony, she had already seen the whole situation. And it was to be expected, because it wouldn't have happened without incidents. Already seated in the carriage and heading home, Ines offered Kayod half of the winnings if he became her representative. But as a true gentleman and lover of Lady Eldrin, Kayod warned that this was unnecessary. But Ines asked Kayod not to refuse the offer so easily, because she already felt that they would be the ones to take the big prize. Ines addressed Kayod and suggested that imperial support alone was not enough to lead the knightly order, and that she would like to help with this. And Ines also warned Kayod that Lady Rani would have a person no less talented than him. The next day, sitting in her office, Ines thought that the duel was a very good idea for Rani, and that it would be good to break her and win, because this would attract the attention of many people. Suddenly, Ines came up with the idea of opening her own business, which would attract a large number of people from society. And then she decided to set up stands for spectators, charging money for admission, and then promote the new business and product. When Ines received Kayod's approval, she immediately got to work because she needed to develop a product to publicize the duel. Arriving at a store where a large quantity of cosmetics was sold, Ines wanted to give preference one last time. But after examining all the shelves, she realized that nothing had changed since her last visit here. That the quality of the products was mediocre for that price, and that there weren't as many stalls as we would like. Ines understood that the market was monopolized by several companies. It wasn't that big, and therefore, the cosmetics market was not attractive to entrepreneurs. Although Ines remembered one of the misfortunes she had seen, which is that the cosmetics business would grow so much. Continuing to look at different jars, Ines knew that the cosmetics market would be a success. But she didn't understand what the impetus for it was. For Ines, the most important thing was to differentiate herself from existing products and create such a new product that it would revolutionize the entire market. Suddenly, Ines heard a young woman asking to tell a consultant about her new product, or to leave the store. But the girl insists on her promise not to take long and hands him the product so he can at least take a look. But the consultant pushes the girl's hand away and asks her not to interfere. As at this moment, the girl's new product slips out of her hands and falls right in front of Lady Eldrin's feet. Chammer immediately picks up this product from the floor and hands it to the lady. After examining it, Ines couldn't understand what it was. So Ines told the girl that her product was in her hands. The girl approached, thanked the lady, and while taking her thing, accidentally touched Ines' hands. And then Ines saw that the cosmetics market had grown significantly after the launch of the girl's products. But if she had received more investment, she would have been more successful. Ines apologized to the girl for accidentally touching her, but there was only one thing on her mind. The person for whom the market would start moving came to her himself. Ines immediately decided to ask what the sweet girl had dropped, but before she could answer anything, the consultant immediately warned that if they weren't going to buy anything, they could leave the premises right now. Looking at this poor consultant, Ines told her that lately, in department stores, you even have to pay to be in them, and she ordered Seymour to buy something. Seymour addressed the lady by her first and last name and immediately went to make a purchase when suddenly the consultant's face changed, because she had contradicted Lady Eldrin herself. Now Ines offered to speak with the girl in private, but she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Mrs. Ines Eldrin was standing in front of her. The girl handed her business card to Lady Eldrin and introduced herself as Quetzalcoatl, adding that she had her own small business. And then Lashit began to talk about her product, for which the most important priority in developing it was convenience, so that the product could be easily carried anywhere. Ines knew this was an incredible product, a lip product she could easily carry with her. It was exactly what she was looking for. Lashett also explained to Lady Eldrin that they hadn't found a distribution route yet. And they hadn't established large-scale production, as there was no normal investment. To be completely sure, Ines decided to examine the girl again and asked Lashett if it was necessary to engage in mass production, since it is currently difficult to distribute her product. With a confident voice, and without the slightest doubt, Lashett laid everything out, explaining that they had been studying market trends for more than 5 years and producing cosmetics, and this product will revolutionize the market. And she also wants to lay a solid foundation so that there are no reductions in the future. Meanwhile, while testing Lashett's product, Ines admitted that she likes ambitious people. Because to achieve success, you have to want it. After testing the lipstick, Ines approved the product. Then Jet started talking about investing, but Ines immediately interrupted her. Having said that she will not invest, she will simply buy them. Because if Lashett reaches the top, Lady Eldrin will give her all her support, and next time the consultant will beg her to enter the store. Lashett thanked Lady Eldrin for her kind words, but to her shame. She admitted that during the product development, she had taken on large debts. Ines laughed and revealed Lashett's terrible secret that when you start your own business, debts are inevitable, so she was willing to pay off all her debts. Ines asked Lashett where she got the money, from a bank or somewhere else. Waving her hands, Lashett said that she didn't get anything from the bank, but from the Ammon Financial Company. Ammon is a lending company that Ines knew very well, because it manages a gambling house. The worst of all evils. Lashett admitted that she took $300,000 from them, but then she was informed that, taking interest into account, her debt increased to $500,000, and at this moment, the interest has increased even more. Ines understood that going to Ammon was not the best decision, but once she herself had no choice but to go there. Now she was ready to pay off Lashett's entire loan, but on one condition: that she would take her to the top. Surprised, Lashett asked why Lady Eldrin had agreed to this step. Looking at Lashett, Ines replied that she believed in her profitability. But in her thoughts, Ines had no idea why she was so honest with people she was seeing for the first time in her life. With her arms crossed over her chest and in a serious voice, Ines asked Lashett if she was sure she could lead the business to success. Since Ines trusted her proposal, and if she agreed to sign the contract, she would live her life without needing anything. After this, Lashett's eyes lit up, and she promised Lady Eldrin that she would take her to the top. Upon going out to the street, Ines invited Lashett to sit in the carriage. Shammer asked the lady where to take them. Ines asked to take them to the Ammon Financial Company. Rumors had already begun to circulate in the Asdian house that Lady Herbert had challenged Lady Eldrin to a duel, even saying that this duel was for a man, and the one who wins will catch him. Hearing all this gossip, Callot only dreamed of a quiet life, and now he himself had become a representative in the duel. Callot remembered Ines' words that it was a very profitable offer, and that half of the winnings she mentioned would be a good help for the 3rd detachment of knights, which lacks funding. Moreover, Callot was ready to fight any opponent, because before picking up the demonic chi, he often participated in sparring matches in the first squad. But that was before, and now that he was the commander of the 3rd detachment of knights, Coyote didn't have time for fencing due to business matters, because the 3rd detachment occupies the lowest position among the knights. Thinking about work, Coyote's mind still couldn't stop thinking about Ines, saying that she was greedy for handsome men, and that Callot looked especially beautiful today. Upon arriving at the designated place, Callot told his knights his plans, that today their main objective was the Ammon gambling house. According to what they told Callot, illegal drug transactions were taking place there, and their goal is to catch the moment of the transaction and arrest those involved. So they must be focused. Before they had time to enter, his knights noticed that the first bet had already begun, where the bet was 1.8 million pruels. The knights were shocked by the amount they heard, and began to calculate in how many years they could earn that amount of money. There were only 2 assumptions in Cald's head. Either he was an avid gambler, or there was another person like Ines who was willing to bet that amount, when suddenly a lady with the same ash-blonde hair walked in front of him. Hamid sat down at the gaming table and asked Ines if she would regret it later. But Ines was confident in herself and replied that she had to wait until the end of the game to know. But half an hour before the match, many interesting things happened. For example, Hamid, the head of Ammon, did not expect to meet Mrs. Ines Eldrin as a guest. After greeting each other, Hamid reminded Ines that many years had passed since their last meeting. But Ines was not solemn for long and explained to Hamid that she had come to him on a matter for the shed, and that she intended to settle her debt of 300,000 prul. Hamid laughed, because if the principal amount of the debt is 300,000, taking interest into account, this amount has increased to around 900,000. Ines asked Hamid if this was written down anywhere, to which he replied that everything was described in the document. If a person did not pay the debt, then the interest doubled. But for Ines, all this was familiar. And it turned out that no matter how many years passed, nothing changes in the past. Hamid was very tired of Ines, and that's why she gave him everything he asked for. And this unpleasant look, that is desperate to get a higher interest rate, continues to deceive naive people. Ines told Hamid that 900,000 is not such a large amount, but in Ines' subconscious. She is not ready to give even a single proof to a bastard like him. Taking out the check and starting to write it, Ines said that according to rumors, Hamid had lost a lot of money recently. She hoped that the gambling house and gambling had nothing to do with it. Smiling, Hamid reminded Ines that she was once a very famous person. After issuing a check for 900,000, Ines invited Hamid to discuss with her. Having told him the rules that the base bet will be 900,000. In addition, the loser will be charged a fine of another 900,000. And a total amount of 1.8 million. Hamid's eyes lit up at this proposal, and he agreed and offered to shake her hand so that everything would proceed fairly. And without deception, when the table was ready and the players took their places, Hamid let Lady Eldrin start the game first. Having thrown the dice and taking her first card in her hands, Ines couldn't believe she was already seeing misfortune. The scope of her abilities was really expanding. In the end, it turned out that Hamid was manipulating the dice, but Ines did not expect a fair coincidence with him. And she came up with a way to solve this problem. It was Hamid's turn to roll the dice. He was clearly determined to win. After rolling the dice, it turned out that Hamid actually won the first round. He was very happy about this because he was closer to 1.8 million. When it was Ines' turn, she picked up the dice and accidentally shook her hand. And the dice fell to the floor and broke into many pieces. Having apologized, Ines said that they needed new dice now. Hamid reassured the lady and told her that he would prepare everything now. But Ines stopped Hamid and told him that the dice were the same everywhere, and they could borrow them from the next table. Before rolling the dice, Ines remembered a moment from her childhood about the same Ammon gambling house before her mother's death. Ines told him that she wouldn't tell anyone about her ability. But after a while, Ines broke her promise. Her mother was in such a serious condition that she couldn't get out of bed, and the treatment costs only increased. The Count of Eldrin was on the verge of bankruptcy due to the support of Marquis Herbert. Everyone refused to lend a hand, and Ines had no choice but to ask for a loan. In those difficult times, Halo was very scared, because different people often came to their house and demanded payment of the debt, and after every visit, Halo shouted at Ines to sell the mansion for the debts. But Ines always reassured her brother by telling him that she would fix everything soon. And when Ines was left with a huge debt that she couldn't pay, she decided to use her skills and protect her family. Instead of going to the lenders of Ammon, Ines went to the Ammon gambling house. And from there, she began to actively use her ability. This time it also happened. A couple of slight hand movements, and Ines already had wonderful winning cards. Hamid was not prepared for defeat and began to accuse Lady Eldrin of cheating, since she couldn't have such good cards. Ines was a little surprised by the accusations she heard and asked Hamid if he had any proof of it. But Hamid insisted, hitting the table with his fist and saying that this couldn't happen. Ines began to explain to him that if she had cheated, Hamid would have lost his credibility because he owned a gambling house. Which means that people are cheated here. These words greatly angered Hamid, but as she got up from the table, Ines asked him not to be so chivalrous in the future. Moving further and further away from the table, Ines also remembered the bet of 900,000 and the fine of 900,000, which Hamid had to cover at the end of the evening. Approaching Shammer and Lashet, they admired Lady Ines and told her that they supported and believed in her victory. Then Ines suggested returning to her business, as one problem had already been solved. But suddenly, on the second floor, Ines noticed a man who looked painfully like Coyote. Ines warned Seymour that she would go up to the second floor to meet her goose. And she asked the girls to wait a little. Upon going up to the second floor, Ines found no one and couldn't understand how Coyote could disappear so quickly. Having walked a little further, Ines' ability worked, and she saw another of Coyote's misfortunes, for which he blames himself, as Ines herself will suffer because of him. Ines, still standing on the second floor, didn't understand why she should suffer, when suddenly Coyote appears behind her and asks what she is doing here. Ines turned to Coyote and began to explain that she had come to settle her business partner's debt. Ines, satisfied with a smile on her face, asked Sir Coyote what he was doing in the Eamon gambling house. Coyote only had time to say he was on a mission when Ines had already started offering her help, and to say that she had just missed the criminal after contacting him. Closing her eyes and waiting, Ines only thought that Coyote just needed to ask for help. But unfortunately, this did not happen. So Ines took matters into her own hands and pointed to the man in red standing downstairs. At that moment, Coyote's knights approached them on the second floor, who were a little surprised to see the commander alone. Coyote immediately ordered to catch the man in red standing on the first floor. A couple of seconds later, that man was already lying on the floor and shouting for these strange people to let him go. Coyote also approached them, showing his badge, explained to the man in red that he was arrested for drug trafficking. And at that moment, Ines noticed a new victim and, turning to Coyote, suggested that he eliminate the problem at the root. Upon going up to the second floor, Ines understood that Hamid had a disgusting side, and when she approached his office, she pulled the doorknob. It turned out to be locked. So Coyote asked Ines to step aside a little and kicked down Hamid's office door in one blow. When Ines and Kalat entered, they noticed that Hamid was hastily collecting all his jewelry and money. Everything was as Ines expected. As soon as the knights appeared, this cowardly dog immediately rushed to grab his belongings and run away. Hamid, enraged, began to shout at Ines that all this was her fault and that she had deliberately placed him in front of the knights. But the unflappable Ines reminded Hamid that one cannot be such a greedy person, because sooner or later everything will end in tears. Hamid was in no hurry to give up his money, showing Coyote that he had worked hard to earn it all. Coyote was tired of listening to all this nonsense and preferred to solve the problem in another way, hitting Hamid to bring him to his senses. But at that moment, a huge wrought iron chandelier on the ceiling began to swing right above Coyote, and Ines had no choice but to save him. Jumping onto Coyote and knocking him down, Ines saved him without even thinking for a minute about her health. Having regained consciousness, Ines began to examine Coyote and ask him if he was injured, since the misfortune was avoided. Upon getting up, the sword informed the owner that Brulik was injured, and Coyote immediately began to ask Ines what and where she was bothered, but Ines modestly replied that she felt a slight pain in her ankle. Taking Ines in his arms, Coyote apologized for such an awkward situation and told her that now they would move to a quieter place and he would examine her ankle himself. But Iniakutes reminded Kalat that Hamid was lying in the middle of the room, but for that Kalat asked her not to worry, since his knights would take care of him. Having found a secluded spot and seated Iniakutes on the sofa, Kalat asked permission to examine her ankle. After the examination, Kalat saw small abrasions and a bruise and immediately provided first aid, and recommended that Iniakutes consult a doctor upon arriving home. Iniakutes tried to reassure Kalat by telling him that in a few days everything would be fine, and the bruises would disappear along with the pain. But Kalat didn't seem to hear Iniakutes, thinking that she was just lucky because if someone else had been in Iniakutes' place, she would have received more serious injuries. Kalat didn't want anyone to get hurt because of him. With teary eyes, Kalat decided that it was stupid to prevent misfortunes, and that next time everything could end differently. He warned Iniakutes one last time that if she wanted to live a normal life, then it was better for them not to be together. As his misfortune is like a virus, Kayod always caused pain to those around him. And in the end, he was left only with the insult, because such pain can only be endured alone. So Kayod asked Iniakutes not to approach him anymore. Iniakutes was bewildered by what she heard, replying to Kalad that if he was going to give up, he wouldn't have started all this. Iniakutes began to tell Kalad that it might take a long time to find the root cause of the misfortune. And that's why people blame themselves or others. Lifting Kalad's head slightly and looking him in the eyes, Iniakutes concluded with a very important fact that she would survive even if the whole world came to an end. After these words, Kalad no longer wanted to expect anything. He abandoned everything and surrounded himself with a wall so he could take it for granted. But today, he had the feeling that for the first time, he saw someone behind this solid wall. Kalad wanted to believe for once that he would live and smile despite the misfortunes. A few days later, while doing business, Chammer handed Lachette's letter to Mrs. Iniakutes, in which Lachette wrote that the production capacity was 100 pieces per day, and that in a week they could start production. Iniakutes asked Shamora how the renovations regarding the store's interior were going, to which Shamora replied that almost everything was ready, although it might seem strange to Iniakutes. But everything was going very well. Shamor also informed the lady that Hamid had been imprisoned and his assets confiscated and, therefore, he could not get bail. This news pleased Iniakutes. She told Shamor the location of the hiding place she saw when she made contact with Hamid, and ordered him to donate all that money to the orphanage. Anonymously, moving her leg more comfortably, Iniakutes remembered about her ankle. Everything happened as she said. After a few days of rest, the swelling and bruises subsided, and now she could walk normally. Chammer talked about what happened and told the lady that this was not like her, but that usually the lady solved problems without personal involvement. Iniakutes explained that she knew from Kayot's misfortune that she herself would suffer, but she didn't have time to think about it, and the body moved on its own. After such a question, Iniakutes still thought about the fact that no matter how important Kayot is, he is no more important than herself. But why exactly at that moment did her heart start beating much faster? And she rushed to protect him. But all of Iniakutes' thoughts were interrupted by the sudden braking of the carriage. Shamior, frightened, asked the lady how she was, and from the street came the coachman's voice, who was also interested in the lady's condition, explaining all this by the fact that someone had suddenly jumped in front of the carriage. At the same time, in the imperial palace, His Majesty was informed that Duke Helios had arrived. Having given the go-ahead for entry, Duke Helios greeted His Majesty at the threshold. Who is the son of the Empire, but Carries asked to discard all these formalities, since they had known the Duke for a long time. Duke Helios was the Emperor's father-in-law, and the Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Knights asked His Majesty what matter he had summoned him for. His Majesty asked Helios what he knew about Kaladastian, but he replied that Kalad was a member of the Imperial Knights. So His Majesty decided to assume that Kaladastian might be related to Duke Helios. And upon hearing such a suggestion, the Duke bowed. And His Majesty continued by saying that he was very surprised when he saw Kayod at the knight appointment ceremony, a man who looked very much like his late daughter. Duke Helios confirmed the identity of Kalodas Dion to Her Majesty the Empress, as Chares expected, which even the Duke confirmed. But Kalodas Dion was not his son. Helios clarified that the duchy carefully monitors collateral relatives, so it would be impossible to hide the child. His Majesty remembered the day the Empress was pregnant, because then he imagined that the child would have his face. But it turns out that Kalodas Dion is the same age as the Crown Prince. Duke Helios was indignant. He didn't understand what His Majesty meant, because despite how bad his relationship with His Highness the Crown Prince was, how could he think of such a thing? And His Majesty remembered the day the Empress gave birth. That day he left the palace for a while, and upon hearing the news of the child's birth, he immediately rushed to the Empress. But she died during childbirth, and Chares saw his son a month later while he was busy with his wife's funeral. That day, the midwives and maids reported that the Empress had given birth to a baby. But they also mentioned the mark of belonging to the ruling family. But Chares couldn't understand why he couldn't get rid of the tremor that ran through him. Why did he suspect his own son and not the Empress? The day of the duel arrived. A crowd of people gathered in the knight's arena, as such grand duels hadn't been organized in a long time. And the atmosphere was like a party. In the stadium, people wondered who was betting on whom, and those who didn't understand what they were talking about. They were immediately explained that tickets were being sold to bet in front of the stadium. Standing among the crowd of people placing bets or rushing to put money down, Ines knew that she would win a lot of money today. And the one who had already made his bid and taken his place of honor was discussing the latest gossip about the owner of the demonic sword, saying that although he is a representative of the Imperial Knights, he cannot defeat the mercenary who lives on the battlefield. Walking to her place of honor, Ines heard talk that Lady Herbert had made many efforts to catch the Black Wolf. But this only amused Ines. Ines took her seat in her box and asked Shammer how things were going with the odds. Shammer, after studying the whole board, reported that the odds were 7-2 in their favor. Ines ordered Shammer to bet more on them, because the greater the difference, the greater the profit. The main thing is that the odds don't drop. A mercenary on Lady Herbert's side, nicknamed the Black Wolf, had already tried to provoke Kalot, inviting him to refuse the fight, since he had promised Lady Rainey not to spoil his opponent's pretty face. But in the end, he added that he couldn't control the situation if he lost his temper. And before the situation got out of control, he suggested that everything be resolved amicably. Kalot looked at his opponent as if he were a small child, reminding him that they were having a duel, not a debate. When the duelists heard that the duel had begun, their swords locked in a fierce battle. Sparks only jumped from the swords, just like from their masters, who were determined to win. While fighting, Kalot's head heard Ines' words, which she told him before the duel. She asked him not to let everything end too quickly. Ines asked Kalot to keep her opponent standing longer. Kalot tried to explain to Ines that he couldn't do that because, when it came to fencing, he wanted to fight with all his might. Ines understood Kalot's feelings, but asked people to also understand when they expected a battle. And it ended in a minute, especially since they paid the entrance fee, so Kalot had to give the people a show. Kalot knew he would have to fulfill his part of the deal, as he accepted half of the winnings Ines offered. Throughout the duel, Kalot only heard from the stands that he was weak, that without a demonic sword he was worth nothing, and that if he was a member of the Imperial Knights, he should at least be able to use a sword. His opponent also added fuel to the fire, telling the owner of the demonic sword that he was nothing. But Kalot couldn't even imagine that his opponent's skills would be so poor, since he expected to fight a worthy and stronger fighter. This whole spectacle began to bore Kalot, and he began to act, showing everyone what he was really capable of, stopping fighting halfway. The spectators in the stands were horrified when they saw Kalodas Dion cornering the mercenary. The Black Wolf felt hurt by this, because he didn't want to give up and disgrace himself in front of so many people. So he warned Kayod that his end would come very soon. But after these words, Kayod realized that it was time to end this whole performance and, having gained strength, he struck his opponent's sword so that it scattered into small pieces throughout the arena. Everyone began to applaud, and words about the victory of the owner of the demonic sword were heard throughout the arena. Kaloda's Dion. In other words, Lady Ines Eldrin becomes the winner of the duel. Kayot was left without the slightest emotion on his face. His only thoughts were about how boring the duel was and whether Ines would be happy with this victory. Approaching Kayot, Ines wiped the sweat from her face and told him that he was a great guy. And that in the end, he had overcome his opponent very coolly. But now was the perfect time for Ines to announce her new product, although Kayot was surprised. The girls were surprised and got up from their seats to get a better look at what Lady Ines was applying to her lips. Returning again to Kalot and hugging him towards her, Ines thanked him for the victory he achieved for her, and kissed him tenderly on the cheek as a sign of gratitude. Meanwhile, Rennie was nervous and had already approached the cheerful Ines, who was not only announcing her product, but also kissing her lover in front of everyone. Ines asked Rennie if she wanted to tell her something, but Rennie, as always, taking everything hostilely, began to say that Ines had insulted her. Looking at Rennie, Ines explained to her that it was her fault for taking the truth as an insult, and now she should apologize for it, but Rennie replied to Ines that she would never apologize. Then, with her head held high, Rennie turned sharply and headed for the exit without answering Ines. Kayot looked at Ines and asked if Rennie shouldn't have apologized, but with a smile Ines replied that this was the norm for Rennie. After all, if Ronnie had apologized, Ines would have felt somewhat uncomfortable. But now Ronnie had to understand that she had thrown words to the wind, since for an aristocrat, honor is equal to life. But in front of such a crowd, Rennie abandoned her honor, pride, and simply ran away. And when she returns, high society will not forget her act, and Rennie will regret it for the rest of her life. Upon returning from the duel, Ines asked Kayod if anything had happened to him lately. But Kayod asked her not to worry about him. Then, taking Kayod's hand, Ines wanted to see what would happen in the future, and meanwhile Kayod repeated that nothing special had happened after the chandelier fell. Looking at Kayod's tired and exhausted face, Ines realized that not everything was so well. And only then did he admit that he was tormented by nightmares. Hearing this, Ines squeezed his hand tighter. Will everything be because of that situation with Dihad? She asked, but Khaled denied it. In fact, that day, when Ines' carriage stopped abruptly, Dihad Azdian jumped onto the road, who had been specially waiting for Lady Eldrin. Getting out of the carriage, Ines asked Dihat what he wanted from her, and in response, Dihat spoke of some kind of invitation, to which Lady Eldrin did not respond. Inem didn't understand how the invitation was being discussed. Most likely, Shimmer simply deleted her letter. But Dihat's topic changed drastically, and he was already asking Lady Eldrin about the rumors that Lady Herbert had challenged her to a duel. Without any doubt or shame, Dijat asked Lady Eldrin for permission to become her representative in the duel. Upon hearing such a proposal, Ines was surprised. Even Shammer's face changed upon realizing that if this happened, the lady would definitely lose. Out of decency, Ines decided to ask Dijat if he trusted his skills, satisfied and confident. Dijat told the lady that he had been fencing for a long time. When suddenly the sound of hooves was heard behind them, it was Kayot riding his horse so fast. Noticing Dihat next to Ines, fearing that this crazy Khaled would not slow down, Dihat quickly jumped aside so as not to be demolished. When Kayot dismounted from his stallion, he held a beautiful bouquet of wildflowers in his hands, as an apology for the fact that Ines had injured her leg because of him on that terrible day. The indignant Dijat began to introduce Khaled, who had appeared out of nowhere and was interfering with his conversation with the beautiful lady. Khaled, looking at Dijat, He didn't even want to ask him anything, but Iniakutes told him about the proposal she had made. She wanted to act as a representative. This made Khalad laugh a lot, and he asked Dijat how he was going to participate if he really didn't have a sword in his hands. Dijat immediately began to make excuses, saying that he had joined the fencing club at the academy. But Coyote remembered that after a week of studying, Dijat stopped training. This touched Dij's feelings, and he asked Lady Eldrin why she chose this brat. Because it's better to choose the person you like the most, pointing to himself. Looking at the offended Dijat, Iniakutes asked him what he liked so much about her. Scratching his head, Dijat began to list Iniakutes' qualities, telling her how beautiful, talented, and rich she was, and he explained that when he first saw her, he realized that this was exactly his destiny. But Dijat's answer brought back old memories to Iniakutes of countless marriage proposals received from families on the verge of bankruptcy. Despite the different content, the meaning of all the letters was the same: for her to marry and cover all the debts. These letters were sent by the young and beautiful Ines Eldrin, but for all the senders. She was just a beautiful product in a shop window. Iniakutes hated all this so much that she became rich, and after that even more offers of supposed marriage began to arrive. She realized that if she lost her beauty, her business would fail, and she would find herself on the verge of bankruptcy again. Then love proposals would not reach her. All these memories brought a slight sadness to Iniakutes, so she replied to Addy had that she was too good for him. But Addy had didn't like this answer, and then he realized that it was all because he was not a successor. And he began to explain to Lady Eldrin that Kalot was fake and in the near future. An angry Kalot interrupted Addy had, shouting at him to shut his mouth and not say another word. Smiling, Dijat realized that he had touched Kalad very well and continued talking about Iniakutes' succession. Standing on the sidelines, she watched this whole nightmare with a look of surprise on her face. Then, interrupting their argument, Iniakutes explained that she didn't care who would lead the Asdian family, whether Kalad or Dijat. Placing her hand on her heart, Iniakutes said that the most important thing for her is the face. She admitted once again that she likes handsome men. Turning around and returning to the carriage, Iniakutes decided to joke with Dijat, telling him that if he became handsome, she would consider his candidacy and called Kalad. And when they got into the carriage, Iniakutes realized that Kalad's position in the family was as difficult as hers. And therefore, Iniakutes deliberately did not raise this topic. Iniakutes told Kalot that she didn't care in the slightest about Dijat's words, and that she asked Kalot to become her lover, not for the successor of the family. But this whole situation somehow influenced Kalot, and he decided to tell Iniakutes why he became the successor to the Asdian family, admitting that he was destined to die instead of Dijat. Inside Iniakutes, everything turned upside down and ignited with a burning flame. She didn't understand what it meant to die instead of Dijat. So Kayot asked Iniakutes a very simple question. Did she know why he was adopted by the Asdian family? Iniakutes began to reveal information about the Asdian family contained in reports and rumors from high society, namely that the Asdian couple did not have an heir. Kalot seemed to agree with this answer, but decided to clarify that to conceive a successor, he was adopted. He recounted in more detail that the adoptive parents had not had children for a long time, and therefore they decided to resort to a fortune teller who predicted that if they adopted Kalot, they could conceive a child. And a few years after the adoption, Dijat appeared, whom they had dreamed of so much. And Kalot thought they would abandon him. But everything happened completely differently. The Marquis and Marquise chose Kalot as their successor, but still treated him coldly. After a while, Kalot learns about the fortune teller's prediction that the heir to the Asdian family is destined to die young. From what she heard, Iniakutes' palms began to sweat. She looked at Kalot with an understandable, pressing gaze, realizing that they did not let Kalot go because they wanted to avoid fate. And they used him for the sake of their son. Iniakutes asked Kalot why he couldn't renounce the right of inheritance. Then there could be problems with the knightly order, Kalot said. Iniakutes was nervous. She shouted at Kalat that the prediction was a mistake and that he would live longer than Da had. Ines decided for herself that now that she was by his side, she would protect him and prove to everyone that Kalat was more alive than all the living. A few days after this conversation, Ines, sitting in her office, read the news. Because after the duel, she began to receive threatening letters from the Herberty family, which Ines then sent to the newspapers. Chamort distracted the lady from reading the newspaper by informing her that the Herberts had sent a man again to dispose of the evidence. But Ines knew that this was only the beginning, and in the future, she intended to destroy the Herbert family. But not only the honor of the family, but also the name itself. The more Ines thought about her plan, the more she began to remember everyone from the past. And then she decided to go relax. Today was a very important day for Ines because today was the start of sales for Eldrin Cosmetics. Upon arriving at the store, Ines and Shammer saw a huge line stretching to the store. And passing by, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. But suddenly, among the crowd, Ines sees Lachette and, approaching her, asks why she is among all the girls. Lachette explained to the lady that, due to the long queue, she couldn't get into the store. Lachette's eyes shone like the most expensive diamond. She told the lady that they had won a big prize and that she was sure success awaited them. Ines agreed with Lachette and added that it was her merits and everyone came to see her product. These words gave Lachette even more motivation, and then she decided for herself that she would no longer be afraid. And they would take care of everything. At that moment, Lachette raised her hand and shouted for everyone to make way for the creator. Chammer was surprised when everyone parted, and Ines smiled, because according to Lachette, it was impossible to say she was a brave girl. But if she took out a loan from a private company, then she was brave. The girls in the store looked at all the products and were amazed, because it was the first time they had used something so light. Easy to use, and they thought it was a unique product. Ines, meanwhile, watched every girl with admiration and thought about increasing production already. But suddenly, Ines noticed two girls who were arguing about her product, deciding who had been queuing since dawn and who had simply interfered with the purchase. As the person responsible for all this production, Ines decided to intervene in this small conflict, apologizing to the girls and offering them her advice when choosing a product. Turning around, the girls couldn't believe what they were seeing. Mrs. Ines Eldrin herself wanted to help them. Without hesitation, the girls accepted. Taking one of the lipsticks, Ines began to tell one of the girls that a light shade would suit her fair skin, and that this particular lipstick would look great on her lips. For another girl, Ines chose a different lipstick with a special color that the girls simply couldn't notice, although the shade of the lipstick would match her outfit very well. The girls immediately took the lipsticks, forgetting their argument, and Ines became convinced that she definitely needed to take the bull by the horns while such a wonderful opportunity existed. Meanwhile, at the headquarters of the 3 Airy Knights detachment, sitting on a bench, Kalad was polishing the sword, but his demonic sword asked the owner if he often used this new sword. Hinting at resentment, but Kalad was lost in his own thoughts. He recalled that same day of the duel, when for the first time someone smiled at him and kissed him in front of so many people. This was the first time in Kayad's life. Kayad still couldn't understand why Ines behaved so indifferently towards him. What incomprehensible feelings visited him when she was near? Suddenly, one of his knights appears near Kayad, who is interested in his new sword, saying he had never seen it before and concluding that it is very dear to the commander. Without any emotion and in an authoritative voice, Kayat replied that it was a gift from his beloved. Upon hearing such an answer, all the knights stopped what they were doing and went straight towards the commander. They all wanted to look at this beautiful sword given to their beloved. Showing it to everyone, Kayat thought that Ines had bought him clothes before. This time she gave him a beautiful sword, and it turned out that he only ever receives gifts. So Kayat decided to ask his knights for advice on what they usually give their lovers, because this was also the first time in his life. One of his pupils offered to give her something she would like. Kalot immediately gifted Iniakutes his best jewelry and realized that giving money to Lady Iniakutes was not the best idea. Kalot's sword supported his idea of a gift, telling him that if he continued to be shameless, the Brulik would abandon them. Meanwhile, the knights never tired of the fact that the day had finally come when their commander asked them for love advice. But the whole meeting was interrupted by a messenger. He informed Kayod that an order had arrived from His Excellency Helios, demanding the elimination of slave traders. Slavery is illegal in the Benzian Empire, but slave traders operate secretly in the country. The third detachment, along with Kalod, had been tracking them for a long time, but it was never possible to get information about their base. Commander-in-Chief Helios finally gave the order to arrest the slave traders. Kayod ordered the 5 to remain at the palace. All the others will follow him. They headed for the horses to depart. Upon reaching their destination, Kalod said that he and Namus would take care of the slaves, and he ordered the rest to cordon off the area so that no one could escape. Upon touching the huge gates, someone from the other side asked who had come to them. Pretending, Kayod replied to the question that he wanted to plant peonies for them. The gates opened immediately, and Kalod and Namus entered. The man who received them told them not to rush, as all the slaves were already here, and they had to inspect each one. Kalod clarified whether all the slaves were here or if they were somewhere else. The man started laughing and said that, of course, everything is here, and only here can such strong types be found. Suddenly, Kalot was right behind the man, and his eyes widened as if he sensed something. Yes, right behind him, the man received a fatal blow from Kalot and fell to the ground. Together with Namus, they took the dungeon keys from this poor dead man. Starting to open the doors with the keys, behind them were small children and exhausted people who were considered slaves. Kayot told everyone to come out. The poor exhausted boy looked with teary eyes, confused about what this man was talking about, what exit he was calling them to, and then Kayot said quietly and languidly, "It's time to go home." The children, scared to death, began to ask if they were going to be sold, to which Kayot replied that it was not about selling at all, but to rescue them from this monstrous place. The children's eyes filled with great hope and the desire to return home as soon as possible from this terrible life. Kahilot ordered his assistant to take the children and leave first, but for some reason he called him commander. He wanted to look around, to which Kahilot nodded, and told him to immediately send the boys who were waiting outside. The assistant accepted the commander's order. As he walked towards the exit, Coyote began to think. Because, looking at these children, he sees himself in them, as if it were a feeling of some kind of déjà vu. There was definitely a clear feeling that he was very familiar with this place. Coyote knelt down and held his head, as if he had begun to vividly remember something, and felt sick from those thoughts. If he could see it again, he would give his life. He didn't understand what those memories were, and whose voice he was beginning to hear in his head. When he barely managed to draw the demonic sword, a certain figure appears before us. Turned towards the wall. The blonde man began to talk about how the time had come. The guy who appeared behind him said, "Your Holiness, let's take a look at the sacred tree." They headed somewhere down the hall. The man and His Holiness approached a very large and powerful tree, which was considered sacred. Raising his hand, the voice said that there would be a drought in the south. This voice and the blonde man were the high priest of the great Purnell Temple. The priest can predict the future with the help of the sacred tree, but people consider him special not only because he is a prophet. Purnell is a person whose soul and memories remain alive even after death. He continues his legacy. He is a man who remembers the history of the continent and a sage who sees the future. There has always been only one high priest, and it has always been Purnell. Here he had already released everyone after a certain ritual, but he asked the priest to stay. Purnell asked if the priest who was sent to the emperor's name day had returned, to which the guy replied that he had returned this morning. Did the priest clarify what that priest said? The priest reported that the owner of the demonic sword was fine. He watched the owner for several days, but noticed nothing unusual, which seemed strange to Pernil. Perhaps his memory had not returned yet. By now, he should have remembered his past life. Apparently, he had not yet encountered a real opponent. The priest thought that this was causing a lot of trouble. The sacred tree continues to dry up every day, so prophecies become very blurry. The priest informed him about the rumors, circulating that the owner of the demonic sword was engaged. He asked him to tell him more, and shared that they say he is dating the eldest granddaughter of Count Eldrin. Ines Eldrin. The priest asked Ines Eldrin, the famous investor, owner of the demonic sword. An investor, that's interesting. The priest said he would like to leave for a while. He wanted to meet Ines Eldrin. The cosmetics business is booming. Sales of the limited edition with her signature are also good and multiply by 100 in an instant. It seems that Ines even started thinking about a new business. However, the implementation of large-scale projects remains difficult for influential families. They already control industries such as shipping and construction. In addition, the Gilbert family has taken over the commercial industry. There is no need to point a finger at the sky. She must be careful when choosing her next business. Ines asked for a newspaper to read what was written in the economics column. After studying the newspaper, something seemed to confuse her. In one of the columns, it said that Ines was having a secret affair with J.R. Hoffman. It is really possible that weeklies write about this. Chammer began to say that, indeed, Gillard's letters arrived every day. And she used to sort them, but lately there had been more, and she felt she should mention it. J.R. Hoffman, the eldest son of Count Hoffman, owner of a grocery store. He met Mrs. Ines last year. The lady had a business meeting with the Count, which J.R. also attended. He must have fallen in love with Ines at first sight, and since then, he has been sending her letters insistently. And since last year, he has been offering her his hand and heart. Of course, the lady kept refusing. But from time to time, the lady is flooded with marriage proposals, but this bastard knows no bounds. There were times when men spread ridiculous rumors about an affair, or pretended to be her lovers. But this stalker is driving me crazy. Ines even thought that maybe they should kill him. Chammer said that it could be done so that no trace would remain. She was very angry and didn't even understand that Ines was just joking. Chammer may be harsh in her language, but they really need to do something about it. After Ines found out about the letters, it seems that he was also the one who sent those suspicious gifts. She hoped that at least today everything would be fine. Today is a date and her lover is a knight commander, a trusted man. And if everything goes well, she will be able to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Well, how handsome this man is. Just look at those bright eyes and charming hair. He already had a date with Ines. Ines noticed his tired appearance and asked what was wrong, to which Callot replied that he couldn't sleep. He was having a nightmare again. Ines was wondering what kind of dreams he was having. Since she had no face at all, she asked him not to worry, but how could she not worry if her lover looked so tortured? If this continues, the plan will fail due to his health problems and not because the demonic sword is getting out of control. Ines said she would like to see the play, and asked if Callot minded. He reacted quite embarrassed, to which Ines thought that maybe he didn't want to which he said that he hadn't even been to performances. Ines said that today was a great opportunity to go to the play with him. Upon arriving at the theater, they began to look for their seats. Approaching their seats, someone passing by said, "Die." Having already seen their places, the seat was cut in a cross shape. Callot was surprised and said he would ask the staff to change seats. Ines said that the performance was about to begin, which meant there would be no seats in the stalls. There is no way out, and they decided to go to the box. The stage was beautifully lit. The actors had already begun their performance. Ines looked at Coyote and thought that even commoners go to the theater. And apparently, the Asdian couple never took Coyote to a performance. He was as focused as a cat watching a fish in an aquarium. And his hand was squeezing so tightly. And then Ines carefully and tenderly touched Coyote's hand with her refined hand. He immediately turned to Ines, bewildered. Ines called him cute. It was so cute and romantic to watch them. However, Kalat did not take his hand away. The actress played the role perfectly on this brilliant stage. An equally beautiful chandelier provided excellent lighting. Oh no, it can't be. The chandelier screws seemed to have started to break. There was wild horror and fear in Ines and Kajad's eyes. Screams were heard everywhere. A theater representative came on stage and bowed, apologizing for the situation with the lighting equipment. Since the situation was terrible, he said that the performance should be stopped and a refund could be obtained at the box office. The lady immediately turned to the side. She has not yet seen such incidents. And while she is with him, strange things often happen, but today's event is the work of human hands. As if someone was deliberately trying to ruin their date. Perhaps this same stalker is watching them. Upon leaving the theater, Coyote said that at first he thought the chairs were broken because of his misfortune. But something was haunting him. He told Ines that he had recently received several anonymous letters containing curses and death wishes. Ines was surprised that he didn't say anything about it, to which Coyote replied that this happens quite often. Ines was sure that he didn't pay much attention to the letters, but the letters that threatened him. And his love letters were definitely from a stalker. She immediately decided to tell him. Kayod asked if that meant they should catch him immediately in that case. Ines believed that if the stalker understood their intentions, he would flee immediately. They decided to lure him out and wait for the right moment. Ines and Kayod went to lunch at one of the local establishments, where they were greeted with great joy. The owner clarified if he had understood correctly that her lover was coming with Ines, to which she replied with a resounding yes. The man said that in this case, he would have to try harder than usual. Sitting at the table, Ines began to tell me that she used to come here with Halo when they had no money. And it is so delicious that she remembers this place even after earning a fortune. Ko admired Ines with a kind of cold look, which made her think that something was wrong. Perhaps he thinks that she is going to remember the past by his side. His gaze seemed to encourage her to continue this topic, as if telling her, "Continue. I'm listening." He even seemed quite attentive to Ines. Ines knew about his past, but he knew nothing about her past. She shared that after the divorce, the situation worsened, and now she earns a lot of money. But a couple of years ago, everything was completely different. She saved every last penny, and restaurant visits only happened on special occasions. She asked him if he had the ability to see misfortune back then. Ines replied that yes, and that she suffered a lot because of her and never talked about it. She gained this ability when she was only 10 years old, as she had only seen small misfortunes as a child. Her father took her words as nonsense, and her mother laughed at her. And no matter how much she tried to tell her mother about the misfortunes that were coming, her mother considered it all nonsense or coincidence. And so it went until Ines told her mother about that same misfortune. The father is with another woman, and since then life has taken a turn. The father kicked the mother out of the house, and the Marquis took her and Halo under his care. When her mother was dying, she asked Ines to keep her ability a secret so that bad people could not take advantage of it. Ines tried to keep her promise, but after her mother's death, she had no choice but to resort to her ability. She couldn't lose the rest of her family. And sometimes she regrets it, thinking that she should have started using her power earlier. Maybe then she could have protected her mother. To which Kalat said that was the best option. Kalat said that he himself still regrets some things to this day. For example, the day he took the demonic sword, and at that moment that same stalker appeared behind him. The stalker they talked about earlier arrived at the same restaurant. Since he followed them all the way, it means he doesn't know they noticed him. It would be extremely awkward to turn his head and look him in the eyes. Ines asked Kalat to describe the man sitting behind her. As expected, it was the same Jajard Hoffman. There was an idea to stop him right now, but such food cannot be wasted. And first we have to eat and then decide. The owner approached the stalker to take his order, at the precise moment when he was burning with curiosity about what the lady was whispering. And her lover, Ines and Kaladu, had already brought dishes for dinner. The lady enjoyed this delicious cuisine as usual. She immediately brought her fork with a piece of duck to feed Kalad herself. Like in the most romantic stories, she wanted to see the reaction of that table to these actions, for what love and romance there is between this couple. The lady immediately asked Kalad to take care of her in the same way and feed her with his fork. All these mercies further enraged the stalker. After a few hours of a wonderful dinner for the lovers, they were about to leave. The stalker again followed the couple's steps directly. Ines carefully turned to see him in her peripheral vision. Kayat also noticed the stalker approaching from behind. Lady and Kayat followed him to the embankment to lure Hayat. Approaching a little closer, Kalad abruptly grabbed the stalker's hand and asked why he kept following them. To which Yayard fearfully replied that he was just passing by chance. What nonsense, by chance from the theater itself. The stalker began to ask Ines for help to tell Kalad that she knew him. And that everything was fine. She really didn't want to touch him, but she needed to see him suffer. She saw that he was furious because his attempt to bribe a man at the theater did not work out as he wanted. And they didn't interrupt the date, they also caught him. Jayard began to make very ridiculous excuses, trying to string words together, but he simply couldn't do it. Falling to his knees in front of them, the stalker told Ines that he loved her. He continued to say that, although she never answered his letters, meeting such a monster is inexplicable. Stalker said he felt bad when he heard the news. He started shouting that he was only there to talk, and they called him a stalker. Kalat immediately grabbed the scoundrel by the neck. Kalat knows bastards like jeered. Everyone comes to their senses after getting punched in the face. Lifting the bastard over the water, the stalker immediately began to squeal that he understood everything, and that he would never approach them again. Ines asked him to stop. Kayad threw him to the ground and said he hoped this would never happen again. Taking the sword, he said, if this happens again, he will kill him without thinking on the spot. In a more radical approach than we had planned, Kayad deliberately plunged his sword into the ground, right between Hayat's legs. Kayad asked the lady if he had gone too far, to which she replied no, and that she even liked it. Ines thanked her lover if it weren't for him. This boy definitely wouldn't have given her a quiet life. He replied that he was simply doing his duty, as stated in the contract. In a contractual relationship, where everything seemed to go according to Ines' plans. Minor sensations and a great misfortune that she could not notice. The property of the Marquis of Asdian was engulfed in flames. Everyone around was screaming, "Bring water!" And the flame continued to burn. And then the screams changed to those that sounded that it was all her fault, and call Kayat as soon as possible. What will happen in the next chapters, we will find out very soon.
So,